The chow hall went silent the second she dropped the tray. Not because of the crash, because of what came before it. Sergeant Harlan Meck, standing over a woman half his size, laughing, food slicked across the table she'd just spent 10 minutes cleaning. He did it on purpose. Everyone saw. He called her rookie nurse, said it loud enough for 200 Marines to hear, and not one of them moved. She was small, quiet, wore her scrubs a size too big, and kept her eyes down. She looked like someone who had never once mattered. That was the problem. That was always the problem. Nobody looks twice at the person cleaning the table. Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe in the quiet ones who carry more than anyone knows, subscribe to this channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning fog off Bridgewater Bay hadn't lifted by the time Nora Vance got to the base. She came in through the east gate the same way she always did. Badge first, eyes down, no conversation. The gate guard, a lance corporal named Estes, barely glanced at her. He'd stopped looking months ago. She was just a face that showed up at 6:45, clocked in without drama, and disappeared into the belly of Crane Harbor Military Medical Center like she belonged to the furniture. That was fine. Nora preferred it that way. She changed in the locker room on level B, the one the support staff shared with the laundry contractors. 3 of the fluorescent bulbs had been flickering since February, and nobody had fixed them yet. She pulled her scrubs on in the half-dark, laced her shoes, and tied her hair back in the way that kept it flat and practical and invisible. No jewelry, no perfume. She didn't own a single piece of clothing that made anyone look twice. The cafeteria was her first stop most mornings. Not to eat, but to clean. The medical center's dining facility sat in a building adjacent to the main hospital corridor, a wide industrial space that served both the on-base Marines and the hospital's rotating staff. From 6 a.m. to noon, it was loud, crowded, and constantly dirty. Nora was one of 4 cross-trained nursing support staff rotated through cleaning duty twice a week, a scheduling decision nobody had bothered to explain to her when she was hired. She'd stopped asking about it after the first month. She pushed the cleaning cart out of the supply closet at 7 sharp and started on the far end of the room, the way she always did, back to front, working toward the entrance so she wasn't cleaning behind herself. It was a small habit, meaningless to anyone watching, but she'd learned it a long time ago in a place where small habits kept you alive. The room was filling up fast. The morning meal rush brought in everyone from surgical residents to motor pool Marines, and the noise was constant, trays scraping, chairs dragging, voices layering over each other until the room had a low grinding frequency that pressed against the ears. Nora moved through it all with her head down, her cart in front of her, wiping tables in long even strokes. She was 3 rows in when she heard the voice. Somebody actually gets paid to do that? She didn't look up. She knew the voice, had known it for 6 weeks. Sergeant First Class Harlan Meck, 3rd Battalion Logistics, stationed at Crane Harbor for a joint readiness exercise that was already 2 weeks over schedule. He was loud in the way certain men are loud when they've never once been told to stop. Broad-shouldered, quick with a grin, the kind of person who filled a room not with intelligence but with noise. He was sitting 3 tables over with 4 other Marines, half-eaten breakfast in front of him, leaned back in his chair with the posture of someone performing for an audience. He'd noticed her the second she walked in. He always noticed her. "Hey," he said it again, louder. "Nurse girl, rookie. What's that, your real job, or is this the downgrade?" The men at his table laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Nora kept wiping the table. Even strokes. Don't stop. Don't engage. Her jaw was set in a way that no one would have seen unless they were looking for it. "I'm talking to you." His chair scraped back. He was standing now, and the room was doing what rooms always do. Slowly, unconsciously, pulling its attention toward the source of friction. Conversations dropped half a volume. Trays stopped moving. "What's your name? You got a name, or do they just call you Mop?" Someone at a nearby table let out a short laugh. A resident in green scrubs pretended to look at his phone. A corpsman at the coffee station stared at the ceiling. Nora straightened, looked at him directly for the first time. "Nora Vance, support staff, nursing division, nursing." Harlan Meck said it like it was a punchline he'd been saving. "So you're not even a real nurse, you're just, what? The person who holds the mop so the real nurses don't have to?" I'm on cross-rotation. I do both. Both. He reached over and dragged 2 fingers across the table she'd just cleaned, leaving a smear. Not because there was anything there, just to do it. You missed a spot. The table around him erupted. Not just laughs, relief laughs, the kind that come from people who feel the cruelty of a moment and laugh because they don't know what else to do with it. 2 of his Marines looked genuinely entertained. One was staring at the table. Nora looked at the smear he'd made. Then she looked at him. She did not say anything. She turned back to her cart, got a fresh cloth, and cleaned the smear. That was somehow worse for him. He'd expected either pushback or flinching, and she'd given him neither. She just absorbed it, like it didn't land, like he wasn't worth the energy of a reaction. "What's your classification?" he called after her as she moved to the next table. "What are you actually trained for? Because from here it looks like janitorial." "Nursing support and clinical rotation," she said without turning around. "That means nothing. That means you got a 2-year degree and they didn't know where else to put you." He was playing to the room now, and the room was letting him. "We got actual specialists on this base, trauma surgeons, flight medics, people who trained for years, and they've got you." The rookie nurse, cleaning tables at 7 in the morning. He shook his head with theatrical sadness. "That's rough. That's genuinely rough, sweetheart." She stopped moving, just for a second. Not because she was upset. Her face didn't change, not in any way he would have recognized. But something shifted in her posture, something subtle and technical, the way a person with a long memory absorbs a word they've heard used against them before. Then she started moving again, cloth in hand, same rhythm, and Harlan Mech sat back down convinced he'd won something. Across the room, a man named Colonel Garrett Winslow set down his coffee. He was retired, had been for 3 years, but he still wore the posture of 40 years in uniform, still sat with his back to the wall and his sight lines clear. He'd been at Crane Harbor for 6 days on a DoD advisory consultation and had spent most of that time quietly watching how the base ran. He had the kind of still, patient attention that comes from having assessed dangerous situations professionally for most of his adult life. He had watched the entire exchange, and now he was watching Nora Vance push her cart toward the service corridor with a particular quality of calm that he hadn't seen in a long time. The kind of calm that's not passivity. The kind that's been earned through repeated exposure to things that are much worse than a loud sergeant in a breakfast room. He'd seen that posture before. It took him a moment to place it. Not the face, not the name, but the bearing. The way she planted her feet when she stopped moving. The way her eyes had tracked Mech before she turned away. A full visual sweep, quick and practiced. The way she'd absorbed the insult not with embarrassment, but with something closer to assessment. He made a note in his mind and filed it. Nora Vance had been at Crane Harbor for 7 months. She'd taken the job through a civilian medical placement service, listed her qualifications as a licensed practical nurse with a background in emergency trauma support, and shown up on her first day with 2 references and 0 fanfare. The HR coordinator who processed her intake paperwork had given her a 40-minute orientation video and a laminated badge and told her she'd be shadowing on the general recovery ward for the first 2 weeks. She'd nodded, said thank you, gone to find the break room. The truth was more complicated, but the truth almost always was. She was 34 years old and had been a civilian for 16 months before starting this job. Prior to that, and this is where the official record thinned to almost nothing, she had spent 9 years in a specialized division of the United States military that most people didn't know existed and that she was not permitted to discuss. The discharge paperwork that sat in a filing cabinet at the Veterans Administration listed her MOS as Administrative Communications Support, which was inaccurate in every meaningful way, but accurate in all the ways that mattered to the people who generated it. She did not talk about what she'd done before. She didn't lie about it, but she'd learned that silence was easier than explanation, and that most people, when you didn't offer information, simply filled in the blanks themselves. They saw a woman in scrubs pushing a cleaning cart, and they understood her immediately, categorized her completely, and moved on. This was useful. She had spent years being professionally invisible. Civilian life, as it turned out, didn't require much adjustment. What she hadn't accounted for was Harlan Mech. He had locked onto her the second week after his unit arrived, and she understood why, even if it was exhausting, she was a fixed, predictable target who didn't fight back, which made her perfect for a man who needed an audience and an object. She'd assessed him quickly and without judgment. Not dangerous, not intelligent, but persistent in the way that mediocre bullies always are. He had rank and volume and a social instinct that told him exactly where the room's weak spots were. He wasn't wrong that she was quiet. He was catastrophically wrong about what the quiet meant. She finished her floor rotation at 9:15, changed from cleaning clothes back to scrubs, and reported to the nursing station on Ward 3 for her clinical hours. The ward was mid-sized, handling post-surgical recovery and observation cases. The supervising nurse that morning was a woman named Doris Kaplan, efficient, humorless, and prone to loading cross-trained support staff with the tasks nobody else wanted. "Vance," Doris said without looking up from her screen, "Room 14 needs linen change and fluid check. Room 9 needs vitals logged before 10. And there's a family waiting in the hall for Dr. Okafor, who apparently nobody told anything to, so go tell them whatever Dr. Okafor's update was from this morning." "What was Dr. Okafor's update?" "It's in the chart. Read the chart." Doris turned back to her screen. "You're not in school anymore. Figure it out." Nora read the chart, introduced herself to the family in the hall, a wife and 2 adult sons, all wearing the particular exhaustion of people who had been waiting a long time, and explained the update in clear, direct language, sitting with them for 4 minutes until the sons' shoulders came down from where they'd been living near their ears. She did the linen change in room 14 and logged the vitals in room 9. She refilled the IV bag in room 11 because the nurse assigned to it was running behind and the alarm was about to go off, and she caught a medication transcription error on the board outside room 7 before it reached the patient. She flagged the error to Doris. Doris looked at it, said nothing, corrected it herself, and walked away. This was also fine. The error was corrected. That was the point. At 11:30, she went back to the cafeteria to finish the second half of her cleaning rotation. The breakfast crowd had cleared out, and a smaller lunch group was filtering in. She got her cart from the supply closet, checked the chemical levels in the spray bottles out of habit, same habit every time, same order, and went back to work. Harlan Meck came in at 11:50 with 2 of his Marines and a corpsman from a separate unit who clearly didn't know him well and already looked like he regretted the seating choice. They got food and sat 3 tables from Nora's current position. She kept her head down. "There she is," Meck said, not quietly. "The base's most essential employee." She didn't respond. "I'm serious." He was talking to his table mates now, but pitched loud enough for the room. "I did some asking around. You know what her file says? Nursing support, cross-trained in facility maintenance. That's it. No combat training, no specialized credentials, no deployment history. Nothing. They hired somebody who couldn't make it in a real medical position and gave her a mop and told her to stay out of the way." The corpsman from the other unit looked at the table. He knew when someone was doing something unkind. "She probably doesn't even know the clinical terminology." Meck leaned back. "Hey, rookie." He raised his voice. "What's the difference between a crash cart and a code cart, do you know? Basic knowledge, right?" The room had gone partially quiet again. There was a group of 4 nurses 2 tables over who'd gone very still. Nora straightened. She looked at him. "A crash cart and a code cart are the same thing," she said. "The terminology varies by institution. Most facilities that serve military populations use crash cart because it's faster to say under pressure. The standard layout is defibrillator on top, medications in the top drawer, atropine, epinephrine, adenosine, IV supplies in the second drawer, airway management in the third. Some configurations invert the medication in IV drawers depending on the trauma protocol, but the defibrillator is always on top." Silence. Meck stared at her. That was not the answer he'd expected. He'd expected a blank look, or a flushed face, or an excuse. He'd asked the question specifically because he thought she wouldn't know it. Yeah. He recovered quickly. "Good. So you read a manual." "I've used one," she said, and went back to her work. The corpsman from the other unit very deliberately looked out the window. One of the 4 nurses at the nearby table, a young woman named Priya Sarkar, who was 7 months into her first year, watched Nora move away and felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't admiration, exactly. It was more like recognition, like watching someone do something difficult and make it look like they weren't doing anything at all. The incident that changed everything happened 3 days later. It started, like many things do, with a system failure nobody planned for. Crane Harbor Military Medical Center ran on two interlocked communication networks, a civilian-grade hospital information system that handled patient records, scheduling, and basic internal communication, and a secondary military-grade tactical medical network, referred to on base as the TMN, that integrated with field units, handled emergency coordination during mass casualty events, and ran parallel communication lines to three other installations within the Bridgewater Bay district. The TMN was, on paper, a robust system. In practice, it was 11 years old, had been patch updated 37 times without a full infrastructure rebuild, and was maintained by a rotating staff of technical specialists whose individual knowledge of the full system was partial at best. The lead technician, a staff sergeant named Wallace, had filed 3 internal requests for a full system audit over the past year and a half. All 3 had been deprioritized. At 14:22 on a Tuesday, the TMN went down. Not partially, fully. It happened without warning. One moment the system was routing its normal traffic, and then it wasn't. Every terminal connected to the military network went dark. The backup protocol that should have engaged automatically failed to engage, which meant that the 3 other installations the TMN connected to lost their data link with Crane Harbor entirely, and the emergency mass casualty alert system, the one that activated automatically when a trauma event hit threshold levels, was not only offline, but locked in a loop that prevented the civilian backup system from taking over. The hospital's clinical director, a physician named Dr. Ambrose Fitch, was alerted at 14:25. He was in a surgical briefing. He came out into the hallway with his coffee still in hand and stood in front of a wall of dark screens and said, with great restraint, "What in the hell happened?" Nobody could tell him specifically. Staff Sergeant Wallace, reached by cell phone because the internal lines were also routed through the down system, said it was an authentication loop collapse. The network had rejected its own security handshake and locked itself into a failure cycle. Getting it back up would require locating and resetting the original handshake keys, which were stored in the system's root configuration file, which required access credentials that were currently sitting in a locked office because the officer who held them was off base. "How long to get him back?" Fitch asked. "He's 40 minutes out, sir. Minimum." 40 minutes without a mass casualty link, with 2 units currently running a joint field exercise 5 miles east of the base. "Get me someone who can fix this faster," Fitch said. The problem was that nobody else in the building had the credentials. Wallace knew the system's anatomy, but not its access keys. The backup technician was a reservist who hadn't been on base in 2 months. The TMN's technical documentation was locked in the same system it was supposed to explain. Nora Vance was restocking supply cabinets on the 2nd floor when she heard the alert tone, not through the network, which was down, but through the old-fashioned intercom that someone had thought to activate manually. She heard Dr. Fitch's voice, clipped and controlled, asking for any available personnel with military communications experience to report to the TMN control room on the ground floor. She put the supply box down. She stood still for a moment, a pause that looked like hesitation but wasn't. She was running a calculation. The kind of calculation that takes someone else 10 minutes but takes 3 seconds when you've been running them under worse conditions for years. Then she picked up her supply box, put it in the cabinet, closed the cabinet door, and walked to the elevator. The TMN control room was a ground floor space that most of the hospital's civilian staff had never seen. She had seen it. She made it a practice to learn the architecture of any building she worked in, but she had never had a reason to go in. The door was open now, and there were 4 people inside. Wallace, 2 junior technicians, and a young lieutenant named Brecca, who was doing a very poor job of hiding the fact that she was panicking. Dr. Fitch was in the hallway outside, on his cell phone, with the expression of a man who is keeping it together by force of will. Nora stopped in the doorway. "What's the authentication format for the root configuration?" she asked Wallace. He turned and looked at her. She was in scrubs and had a lanyard with a hospital ID badge. He had never seen her before. "Who are you?" "Nora Vance, nursing support." "I heard the call." She stepped into the room. "What's the format?" "This is a restricted—" "I know it's restricted. I'm asking what format they use for the root handshake. Is it a 12-digit keyed sequence, or did they convert to the modular token system after the last patch?" Wallace stared at her. That was not a question. A nursing support employee was supposed to know how to ask. 12-digit, he said, before he'd consciously decided to answer. Legacy or current chain? Legacy. The last migration got stuck at 80%. She was already at the secondary terminal, the one that Wallace had tried and failed to crack through. She looked at the screen, looked at the error code, looked at the pathway diagram taped to the wall above the station. The kind of old-school paper backup that only people who've lived through system failures keep around. Do you have a direct line to your ISP node, or are you going through the base router? Base router. That's where it collapsed. She was typing, not frantically, steadily, each input deliberate. The loop is in the router's authentication queue. The system thinks it's waiting for confirmation that never came, so it keeps resubmitting the handshake request, and the queue fills up and nothing gets through. You have to break the loop manually before you can push the credentials. You can't break it without admin access to the router's queue management. Yes. She typed 3 more commands. There's a maintenance bypass. Every system built on this architecture has one, and it's always in the same place because the engineers who designed it didn't want to lose access to it in an emergency. She hit enter. The screen flickered. The error code disappeared. And then, from the far end of the room, the wall-mounted status display, which had been dark for 22 minutes, came back on, one indicator at a time. Green lights resolving from left to right like someone was slowly turning on lights in a dark house. The room went completely still. Wallace was staring at the screen. Lieutenant Brecka was staring at Nora's hands. The 2 junior technicians were staring at each other. Dr. Fitch appeared in the doorway, cell phone still at his ear, and looked at the status board. TMN is back online, Nora said. She turned away from the terminal and looked at him. The authentication loop is cleared. Your mass casualty protocol should resync within 60 seconds. I'd recommend getting your lead tech to file a formal architecture review. That maintenance bypass isn't supposed to be accessible from a standard workstation. If I found it in 4 minutes, someone with less honorable intentions could find it faster. Fitch lowered his phone slowly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and what he saw didn't match the badge on her lanyard or the scrubs she was wearing or anything he'd been told about who worked in his facility. Vance, he said, nursing support. Yes, sir. How do you know a military TMN maintenance bypass protocol? She looked at him steadily. I learned it from someone who needed me to know it. He held her gaze for a long moment. She didn't elaborate, and he understood somehow that she wasn't going to. All right, he said. He looked at Wallace. Get that architecture review filed by end of week. He looked back at Nora. Thank you. She nodded, picked up her lanyard, and walked out of the control room. In the hallway outside, she passed a corpsman who'd been listening near the door. He was young, probably 23, with the specific expression of someone who'd just witnessed something they didn't have a category for. She walked past him without looking. She was back at her supply rotation on the 2nd floor by 15:10. But the talk started before dinner. By the time the evening shift change happened at 1700, the story had moved through the building in that specific distorted way that institutional gossip always travels. Partially correct, substantially embellished, and stripped of every nuance that made it complicated. By most accounts, the nurse who cleaned tables had somehow fixed the base's communication network. By some accounts, she'd known things she had absolutely no reason to know. By a few accounts, the ones from people who'd been in the room or close enough to the room to matter, there was something significantly off about what had just happened, but nobody could articulate what. Wallace, for his part, had gone back to his station after the system came up and spent 90 minutes verifying everything she'd done. It was correct. More than correct. It was efficient in a way that suggested she hadn't been guessing. She'd gone directly to the source of the problem, and she'd known exactly what tool to use, which meant she hadn't just read about it, she'd used it, or something very like it. He pulled up the maintenance bypass pathway on the technical diagram that evening and looked at the sequence she'd entered. The first 6 commands matched standard protocol. The last 3 didn't exist in the civilian systems documentation. They were part of a military-grade variant of the base architecture, an encrypted modification developed for high-security tactical networks, and they were not published anywhere accessible to civilian personnel. He sat with that for a while. Then he wrote an internal memo and forwarded it to the installation's security office. Priya Sarkar, the young nurse who'd watched Nora in the cafeteria, heard about the TMN event from a colleague and stood in the break room listening with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She kept thinking about what she'd seen that morning, The way Nora had recited the crash cart contents without hesitation. The way she'd said, "I've used one," and then turned back to her cleaning like it was nothing. Like the whole room's silence was nothing. Harlan Meck heard about it too, at dinner, from one of the Marines who'd been in the cafeteria that morning. He listened, chewing, and then shrugged. "She read it somewhere," he said. "Probably watched a YouTube video." Nobody at his table said anything. Colonel Garrett Winslow heard about it that evening from Dr. Fitch, who called him because Winslow was the senior advisory figure on base, and because Fitch was a careful man who recognized when something needed to be seen by someone with more clearance than himself. He listened to the full account without interrupting. "And she just walked in," he said when Fitch finished. "She heard the call on the intercom. She showed up in the doorway. You said she knew the maintenance bypass." 3 commands that aren't in the civilian manual. Wallace confirmed it. He's written it up. Winslow was quiet for a moment. "What's her file look like?" "Thin," Fitch said. "Licensed practical nurse, 2 employment references, clean record. Nothing military, nothing specialized. MOS listed as administrative communication support on a record from, let me see, 9 years ago, 1 year service, honorable discharge. Administrative communication support. That's what it says." Winslow set down the pen he'd been holding. "That's not what that is," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that classification doesn't exist as a standalone MOS. It's a cover designation, has been for about 15 years. He paused. "Who processed her intake paperwork?" "Civilian HR. Standard placement." "Pull her prints," Winslow said. "Run them against the classified personnel registry, not the general military record system. The secondary archive, the one that handles redacted personnel files." There was a silence on the line. "Colonel, if she's a civilian employee, pull them," Winslow said. "Do it quietly. Tonight." He hung up and sat in his temporary office on the base's east wing, looking at nothing in particular, running a calculation of his own. The posture in the cafeteria. The stillness under insult. The way she'd tracked Meck's position and assessed him in under 2 seconds. The way she'd moved in the control room, not rushed, not uncertain, just efficient in a way that was trained into the body, not learned from a manual. He thought about a specific morning, years ago, in a different part of the world, about a voice on a radio frequency cutting through noise to deliver the exact coordinates that had changed the outcome of something that officially hadn't happened. He pulled out his notebook, wrote one word, IRONVEIL. Then he closed the notebook and waited for the fingerprint results that would tell him whether the woman cleaning tables at Crane Harbor Military Medical Center was who he thought she might be, or whether he was chasing a ghost. The results came back at 2200. He looked at them for a long time. He was not chasing a ghost? The results came back at 2200, and Winslow looked at them for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and made a call that woke someone up. Nora found out about the fingerprint check the next morning. Not because anyone told her directly. That wasn't how these things worked. She found out because she arrived at the East Gate at 6:42, and Lance Corporal Estes, who hadn't looked at her face in 4 months, looked at her face. He held her badge 3 seconds longer than usual before handing it back. He said nothing, but something in the angle of his shoulders told her the hold had been deliberate, and deliberate holds meant someone had flagged her file. She walked to the locker room with the same unhurried pace she always used, and changed into her scrubs with the same sequence she always used. Left shoe, right shoe, lanyard last. And she sat on the bench for exactly 45 seconds and thought through what her options were. They were not numerous. She could go to HR and ask whether there was an issue with her file, which would confirm she'd noticed the flag and immediately signal that she understood what it implied. She could do nothing and wait, which was the same as giving up control of the timeline, or she could go do her job, stay visible, and let whatever was moving move at its own speed while she watched where it was coming from. She chose the third option. She always chose the third option. She got her cart from the supply closet. She went to the cafeteria. She started on the far end of the room, back to front, the way she always did. Harlan Meck came in at 7:20. He sat with the same group as always, but the dynamic was different this morning, and she noticed it immediately. 2 of his usual table mates were quieter. One of them, a Marine named DeSoto, who'd laughed loudest at the jokes about her cleaning rotation, was eating with his eyes down in a way that read as something processed overnight and not fully resolved. Mech himself was louder than usual, which meant he was working to fill a space that had gotten bigger without him meaning it to. "Back at it," he said when he saw her, but the edge in his voice was different. Not confidence, something performing confidence. "TMN's down. Call the janitor, right? That's the new protocol now?" A few automatic laughs, thinner than before. "I heard you held the base together yesterday," he continued. "They're going to put your face on a poster. Got a communications crisis? Find the lady with the mop." She was 2 tables away, and she kept her cloth moving in even strokes. She didn't look up, but she was tracking him, tracking the room, tracking the specific quality of the silence that was spreading from the tables nearest to her. "You know what I think?" He was leaning forward now, the posture of someone who senses a shrinking audience and decides to push harder instead of pulling back. "I think you watched somebody fix it once, and you remembered the steps. Like a, what do they call it? Procedural memory, like how a dog can learn to open a door." He looked at DeSoto for confirmation. DeSoto studied his eggs. "It's impressive in a way. You got a basic trick down, and everybody acted like you walked on water." Nora stopped. She put her cloth down on the table in front of her, and she turned and she looked at him fully, and the quality of that look stopped 3 different conversations in adjacent tables, because it was not the look of someone who was upset or embarrassed or trying not to cry. It was the look of someone performing a very brief, very dispassionate assessment. "Sergeant Mech, she said. Her voice was level and carried. "Do you know what procedural memory actually is?" He blinked. "Sure. It's the neurological encoding of repeated physical actions. It's what lets a surgeon's hands know where to cut when conscious attention is overloaded. It's what keeps a pilot's hands on the correct instruments when the cockpit is on fire." She picked up her cloth. "It's earned through repetition under pressure, not through watching. You're thinking of imitation, which is different." She turned back to the table. "But I understand the confusion." The room was very quiet. Mech's jaw moved. He had a response forming. She could see it, but it was taking too long, and the window for it was closing, and somewhere in his chest he could feel the room shifting, the weight of it redistributing in a way he didn't control. "You've got a mouth on you for a mop jockey," he finally said. She didn't answer. She moved to the next table. The corpsman from the other unit, the same one from the day before, who apparently kept making the same seating mistake, looked at Mech and said very quietly, "Sergeant, maybe—" "Eat your food," Mech said. The corpsman ate his food. Priya Sarkar had come in at the tail end of the exchange and caught enough of it to understand what had happened. She got her coffee and sat 2 tables away from Nora's current position and watched the room decompress. She'd been thinking about the TMN thing all night. She'd talked to one of the residents who'd heard it from a technician. Not the clean version of the story, but the actual version, the one with the 3 commands that weren't in any accessible manual. That detail had stayed with her. She looked at Nora, who was cleaning tables with the focused economy of someone who had learned to complete tasks in the shortest possible time while taking up the least possible space. Priya had grown up in a household where quiet meant small, where invisible meant unimportant. She'd spent her whole first year at Crane Harbor proving loudly that she was neither. It was exhausting, but she hadn't figured out another way yet. She watched Nora and thought, for the first time, that maybe the equation worked differently for some people. That maybe quiet could mean something else entirely, if you'd gotten quiet for different reasons. She didn't know what those reasons were, but she wanted to. The security office called Nora in at 10:15. The office was in the administrative wing, a room she'd walked past 100 times without going into, with a door that was almost always closed. She knocked, was told to enter, and found 2 people waiting, a security officer named Lieutenant Commander Vela and a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Harrington from the DoD advisory staff without specifying what branch of the DoD or what exactly he advised. There was a 3rd chair in the room that nobody was sitting in. The arrangement of the chairs told her the 3rd chair was for her. She sat. "Ms. Vance," Vela said. She was in her late 30s, efficient-looking, with the particular neutrality of someone who has been told not to telegraph their position. "Thank you for coming in." "Of course. We want to follow up on the TMN incident yesterday, specifically regarding the procedures you used to restore the system." "All right." Vela glanced at a paper in front of her. "Our technical staff have confirmed that 3 of the commands you entered are not documented in the civilian manual for this system. They exist in a restricted military-grade variant that requires specific security clearance to access. Nora waited. Can you tell us where you learned those commands? She had thought about this exact question since the moment she'd entered them yesterday. She'd known, in the moment, that she was making a decision. She'd made it anyway because the alternative was 40 minutes without a mass casualty link while 2 units ran live exercises in the field, and that was not a trade she was willing to make. I can tell you that the information is within my working knowledge, she said carefully, from a period of service that I'm not able to discuss in detail without appropriate authorization. Harrington spoke for the first time. His voice was even, practiced. Your service record lists 1 year of administrative communication support, followed by an honorable discharge. Yes, that's the extent of your official record. That's what's in the official record. There was a pause. Vela and Harrington exchanged a glance that was brief and almost imperceptible, but Nora caught it because she was watching for it. Ms. Vance, Vela said, I want to be direct with you. A fingerprint check run against the classified personnel registry returned some results that were unexpected. We're not in a position to share the specifics of those results with you, but I want you to understand that we're taking this seriously. What specifically are you taking seriously? The possibility that your presence at this facility is not incidental. Nora looked at her. I applied through a civilian placement service. I was hired by your HR department. I've been here 7 months doing clinical rotations and supply management and facility cleaning. What about that suggests it's not incidental? The fact that a nursing support employee knows classified network bypass protocols, Harrington said. I fixed your system. You did, and I'm asking how. She held his gaze. I've given you the answer I'm able to give. If you want a more complete answer, that conversation happens at a different level than this room. Another silence, longer this time. Vela made a note. We may need you to come in again. I'll be here, Nora said. I work here. She stood, and neither of them stopped her, and she walked out of the security office and back to her shift. In the elevator going up to Ward 3, she leaned against the wall for a moment with her eyes closed. Not out of distress. She wasn't distressed. Not exactly. She was managing a calculation that had just gotten significantly more complicated. The fingerprint check meant the classified registry had returned a result, which meant someone had access to the secondary archive, which meant someone above the security office's pay grade was already involved. She knew who the likely candidates were. She'd seen Colonel Winslow watching her in the cafeteria 2 days ago from across the room. She'd noted the posture, the sight lines, the particular quality of attention that distinguished observation from curiosity. She'd filed it and moved on because she'd assessed him as low immediate risk. She was revising that assessment now. The elevator opened, and she walked to Ward 3 and started her shift. Dr. Ambrose Fitch called a private meeting that afternoon. He did it quietly. An email to 4 people, no subject line, a conference room on the 4th floor that was used for administrative reviews and was therefore reliably private. The 4 people were Lieutenant Commander Vela, the man Harrington, Colonel Winslow, and the base's commanding officer, a Marine general named Doyle Prentice, who had the particular expression of someone who had been briefed on something he didn't have enough context to fully process and was not enjoying the experience. Winslow did most of the talking. He laid it out without editorializing. The fingerprint results, what the secondary archive had returned, what the classification level of that return indicated, and what the cover MOS meant. He was precise and economical and left spaces for questions, but nobody asked any until he was finished. How long has she been here, Prentice asked. 7 months, Fitch said. 7 months. And nobody. He stopped. Restarted. Nobody looked at her file before this? Her file is clean, Vela said. The cover designation is designed to pass standard screening. It's constructed specifically so that a civilian HR intake process doesn't flag it. So she could have been here, for any length of time, Winslow said. Yes. Prentice was quiet for a moment. Is she a threat? Winslow considered the question. It deserved consideration. I don't believe so, he said finally. But I believe she's here for a reason, and I believe the reason matters. What reason? I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out before we do anything that makes her disappear. Prentice looked at him. She might disappear anyway if she knows we're looking. She already knows, Winslow said. She's been running this calculation since yesterday morning, possibly longer. He paused. She's not going anywhere. People like this don't run. They stay and they manage the situation. People like what exactly? Fitch asked. Winslow picked up the folder in front of him. He opened it to the page the secondary archive had returned. A page that was mostly black lines, redacted to the point of illegibility, but with a few pieces of information still visible. A designation. A service summary in bureaucratic language that stripped all color from what it was actually describing. A call sign. He set it down and let them read it. The room went quiet in a different way than before. She fixed the TMN as a reflex, Harrington said quietly. She walked in and she fixed it because that's what she knows how to do, and she couldn't watch it stay broken. And then she tried to walk back out again, Winslow said. Except she couldn't, because you can't undo something like that. Once people see it, they see it. Prentice stared at the call sign on the page for another moment. Then he closed the folder and looked at Winslow. What do you want to do? I want to talk to her, Winslow said. Not in a security office. Somewhere she can choose to leave if she wants to. Somewhere that makes it a conversation instead of an interrogation. And if she doesn't want to talk? Winslow shook his head slowly. She'll talk. She's already talked. She just hasn't said anything yet. The conversation happened the next morning in the small garden space behind the east wing that the nursing staff used for breaks. It was Winslow who suggested it to Fitch, who passed the suggestion to Nora through Doris Kaplan, who delivered it with the expression of someone who had no idea what was going on and had decided not to think about it. Nora arrived at the garden at 8:15 with a cup of coffee and found Winslow already there, sitting on a concrete bench, not in uniform, civilian clothes, which she noted. The choice communicated something about how he wanted the conversation framed. She sat on the bench across from him. She put her coffee down. Colonel Winslow, she said. He looked up. He didn't seem surprised she knew who he was. Ms. Vance. They looked at each other for a moment in the way that two people look at each other when both of them understand more than they've said and are deciding how much honesty the moment can hold. You ran my prints, she said. Yes. Against the secondary archive. Yes. You had the clearance to access the return. I did. She picked up her coffee and held it in both hands. The morning was cool and the garden was quiet, and she could hear the distant rhythm of the bass starting its day somewhere over the east wing's roof. What do you want to know? She asked. I want to know why you're here, he said. Not aggressively. The question landed like something he'd been sitting with for a while. I work here. You know what I mean. She looked at the garden. A concrete planter with something green and half dead in it, a bench with a missing armrest, a patch of morning light that was actually pleasant if you let yourself notice it. I needed a job, she said. The placement service matched my credentials. The hospital hired me. I've been doing the job. For 7 months. For 7 months. Doing supply rotation and cleaning tables. She turned her head and looked at him. Somebody has to do it. He was quiet for a moment. I remember IRONVEIL, he said. She didn't move, but something in her face shifted. Not much, not in a way that most people would have caught. A slight tightening, a recalibration. The word had landed. That designation is classified, she said. I know. I also know what it refers to. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I was part of the command review that evaluated the Kisra Valley incident. I was a full colonel then. I didn't have access to the operational files, but I knew the outcome, and I knew the communication record that produced it. He paused. I knew there was a controller who guided that strike. I just didn't know the name, or the face, because both were redacted before anything came through to my level. Nora said nothing. The archive return confirmed it, he said. You were IRONVEIL. She looked at her coffee. That's a classified designation. Nora. The use of her first name was deliberate. She recognized the technique, had used it herself. A small informality, deployed at the right moment, that communicated, I'm speaking to you as a person, not a file. She appreciated the precision of it, even as she recognized what it was. She exhaled slowly. What do you want to do with this? She asked. I want to understand why a decorated combat controller with a classified field record is spending her mornings wiping tables and listening to a logistics sergeant call her rookie. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not pity, something older and more complicated. That's not a neutral decision. People don't land somewhere like this by accident. She was quiet for long enough that a sparrow landed on the concrete planter and picked at something and flew away. I left, she said finally. The exit wasn't clean. There were complications. After Kesra Valley, there was a review process that went on for 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, I had an honorable discharge and a cover MOS, and I was told that my record had been handled in a way that protected operational security. She stopped. I didn't agree with how it was handled. I didn't have a lot of say in it. They buried it. They preserved it, she said, with a slight emphasis that communicated she was choosing her words carefully. The record exists. It's just inaccessible. Without the secondary archive clearance, I'm a 1-year administrative support specialist who got out in her mid-20s. Which is what your HR file shows. Which is what my HR file shows. Winslow sat back. He looked at her for a moment in a way that wasn't assessment anymore. It was something more like reckoning. You could have fought the classification. I did, for 8 months. She looked at him, and then I stopped because I was tired, and because fighting requires resources, and because I'd lost more than I expected to lose and I needed to stop bleeding. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask what she'd lost. She was grateful for that. What are you looking for here? He asked. At this base, doing this job. She looked at the garden again, the half-dead plant in the planter, the broken armrest on the opposite bench. Routine, she said, and then, after a pause, something that might have been honesty working its way out through the careful structure she'd built around herself. And I wanted to stay near it, the work. Not the part that gets classified, but the actual work, keeping people alive. I know how to do that. Cleaning tables, doing vitals, fixing a network when it goes down, and the alternative is nobody in the field getting emergency support. She looked at him directly. Yes, all of it. I don't have a preference for which part. Winslow was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There are people who need to know you're here. Her expression shifted fractionally, a kind of wariness. What does that mean? It means your name, your real record, is going to start moving through channels whether you want it to or not. The fingerprint return is in the security office's log. Harrington reports to people I don't control. And the TMN incident is in writing. He paused. The machine is already turning. I can't stop it. I can only try to shape what it does when it gets there. She absorbed this. She was running the same calculation she always ran, updating variables, mapping outcomes. How much time? Days, he said. Maybe less. She picked up her coffee and finished it. All right, she said. All right? I heard you. She stood. Are we done? He looked up at her. She was standing in the morning light in her scrubs and her functional shoes and her tight back hair, and there was nothing about her appearance that communicated any of what she'd just told him, and he thought that was probably the most impressive thing he'd seen in a very long time. Yes, he said. We're done. She nodded once and walked back inside. He sat in the garden for several minutes after she left, and then he took out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a number he'd dialed only twice before, a direct line to a DoD office that handled reclassification petitions for personnel records. He left a voicemail explaining the situation. The second call was to someone he trusted more than most, a woman named Commander Adele Frost, who worked out of a JAG office in San Diego and who had a particular skill for finding cases that the system had misfiled. He told her he had a name. He told her the name was covered. He told her he thought someone had made a mistake a long time ago and that the mistake was still sitting in an archive somewhere and that he'd appreciate it if she'd take a look. Harlan Mech found out about the garden meeting by accident. He was cutting through the east wing at 8:45 and saw Nora walking back through the corridor from the direction of the exterior door, and 20 minutes later he saw Colonel Winslow come through the same door from the same direction. And he was not a perceptive man, but he was a suspicious one. He spent the rest of the morning chewing on it. By the time lunch rolled around, he'd constructed an explanation that satisfied him. She was talking to the old colonel because she'd gone to complain about Mech himself, trying to build some kind of case, playing the victim to get ahead of whatever the fingerprint thing was going to surface. He was not wrong that the fingerprint thing worried him. He'd heard it secondhand from a Marine in the security rotation. Not the details, just that the nursing support woman had been flagged and that somebody with senior advisory clearance was involved. He'd spent the previous night constructing reasons why this was not a problem, and he'd run out of convincing ones. He sat at lunch with two of his Marines and thought about how to get ahead of it. "She went to the old colonel," he said. DeSoto looked up. "What?" "The nurse, Vance. I saw her coming out of the East Garden this morning right before that DOD advisor came through. She went to him." DeSoto was quiet for a moment. "Or he went to her," he said. Mech looked at him. "I'm just saying," DeSoto said carefully. "Those are two different things. It's the same outcome. She's talking to people above my pay grade, which means she's trying to make a problem." He pushed his tray forward. "I'm going to get ahead of it." "How?" "I'm going to go to Major Terrell, tell him about the TMN thing, tell him something's off with this civilian, tell him to check whether she's even supposed to be here." He nodded to himself. "You put a question in early, the question becomes the story. Whatever she's telling the colonel, the first version that reaches Terrell's desk should be mine." DeSoto stared at his food. He had the specific look of someone who understood that what was being proposed was bad, and who was too tired to argue about it. "Okay," he said. He said it because it was easier than saying the other thing. The thing he'd been thinking since that morning in the cafeteria when Nora had recited the crash cart contents and said, "I've used one," without blinking. He'd been thinking it since the TMN, since the garden meeting, since Mech's audience had gotten quieter and quieter, and Mech's voice had gotten louder and louder to compensate. He'd been thinking that the sergeant had made a significant mistake and was now trying to bury the evidence of it, and that the thing you buried had a way of coming up. But he said okay, and he ate his food, and that afternoon Harlan Mech went to Major Terrell and told him a version of events that started with Nora Vance and ended with a recommendation to review her credentials, and specifically whether she had authorization to be in a restricted communications facility. Terrell listened. He wrote it down. He said he'd look into it. He called the security office within the hour, and that was how, at 16:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, Nora Vance was informed that her access to clinical rotation areas was temporarily suspended pending a security review, that she was to report only to facility support duties until further notice, and that her case was being elevated to the base's administrative review board. She was standing in the doorway of Ward 3 when Doris Kaplan told her, reading from a memo that she clearly had not written and was delivering with the expression of someone who had been handed a grenade. Nora looked at the memo. "All right," she said. "I'm sorry," Doris said in the strangled voice of someone who had opinions about this and was not permitted to express them. This came from above me." "I know." Nora looked at her. "You didn't do anything wrong." She handed the memo back and walked to the supply closet and got her cart and went back to cleaning. In the hallway outside Ward 3, she passed Priya Sarkar, who had obviously heard something. Her face said it clearly. Priya started to speak, and then stopped, and then said only, "This is wrong." "It's a process," Nora said. "It's not right." "A lot of things aren't right." She looked at the younger woman steadily. "That's not always the last word." She pushed the cart down the hallway and around the corner, and Priya stood there watching her go. And somewhere in the building above them, the Administrative Review Board was being convened, and in a JAG office in San Diego, Commander Adele Frost was opening an email from Colonel Garrett Winslow and reading a name that made her sit forward in her chair, because she knew that name. Not from any file, but from a conversation she'd had 5 years ago with someone who was one of the few people who knew the full scope of what had happened in Kesra Valley. She read the email twice. Then she picked up her phone and called Winslow back. And the first thing she said was, "If this is who I think it is, we need to move fast. Because somebody already filed a motion in this case 2 years ago, and it was denied at a level that shouldn't have had jurisdiction. And if that denial was improper, then everything that came after it is built on something that doesn't hold." Winslow gripped his phone tighter. "What kind of timeline are we talking about? If I file an emergency reclassification petition tonight, I can have a preliminary ruling in 72 hours. She paused. "But Garrett, I need her to not disappear before I can file it. Wherever she is, she needs to stay." "She's here," he said. "She's not going anywhere." "How do you know?" He thought about the garden, the half-dead plant, the missing armrest, the way she'd said routine like it was a word she'd had to excavate from somewhere. "Because she came back to clean the tables," he said. 3 floors below his office, in a utility corridor with buzzing lights and a cracked floor tile that nobody had fixed, Nora Vance pushed her cart from one end to the other and then back again, And she thought about the motion that had been filed 2 years ago and denied, the one she'd eventually stopped fighting, and she thought about how sometimes a decision you stop making still keeps making itself. And she turned the corner at the end of the corridor and found Harlan Meck standing there with two of his Marines and the hard, deliberate look of someone who had convinced himself he was acting in good faith. "Vance," he said. She stopped. "I just want you to know," he said, and there was something almost careful in his voice, the performance of reasonableness, which was more unsettling than his usual volume, "that I flagged your credentials because it's the right thing to do. If something's off with your file, that's a security concern. It's nothing personal." She looked at him for a moment. "Sergeant Meck," she said, "do you know what the access threshold is for a TMN maintenance bypass?" He blinked. "What?" "The access threshold. The clearance level required to know that bypass sequence exists, let alone execute it." She held his gaze. "Think carefully about what that number means, and then think about whether the thing you just put in a memo to your major is going to look the way you want it to look in 72 hours. He stared at her. She pushed her cart around him and kept going, and neither of his Marines said a word, and Harlan Meck stood in the corridor with a cold feeling he couldn't fully name spreading from somewhere in his chest outward, because she had looked at him not with anger or fear but with something that resembled patience, the kind of patience that comes from knowing exactly what is coming and exactly when. The cold feeling in Harlan Meck's chest didn't leave him that evening. He sat in the barracks common room after dinner with his phone in his hand and didn't look at it, which was unusual for him. Usually he was talking to someone about something, filling the air the way he always filled it. Tonight he was quiet, and the two Marines who shared the common room with him noticed but said nothing because the quality of the quiet was the kind that discouraged interruption. He kept turning her words over. "Think carefully about what that number means. The access threshold for a TMN maintenance bypass." He'd looked it up after she'd walked away, pulling the classification framework on his personal device, and what he'd found had sat in his stomach like something heavy and undigested. The clearance level required to know that bypass existed wasn't just above his pay grade. It was above most pay grades. It was the kind of number attached to the kind of work that didn't appear in any documentation he'd ever had reason to read. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself she'd gotten lucky, or she'd gotten it from someone, or there was an explanation that made her less than what those three commands implied. He told himself that his memo to Major Terrell was procedurally correct, and that procedure was procedure regardless of what it turned up. He went to bed and didn't sleep well and woke up at 5:40 feeling like the day was already ahead of him. Commander Adele Frost arrived at Crane Harbor at 0900 on Thursday. She came in a government vehicle with a JAG insignia on the door and a paralegal named Whitmore, who carried 2 document cases and said nothing to anyone. She went directly to the administrative wing, bypassed the front desk entirely, and walked into the conference room where General Prentice had been told at 0815 that she was coming and why. Prentice had not enjoyed that call. He was in the conference room when she arrived, with Colonel Winslow on one side and Major Terrell, who had filed the security review memo the previous afternoon, and was now sitting with the posture of a man who was beginning to understand the weight of what he'd signed, on the other. Vela was there. Harrington was there. Fitch was there because Winslow had specifically asked for him. Frost set her document case on the table and opened it without preamble. She was 51, compact, with reading glasses. She pushed up her nose before she spoke, and the economical manner of someone who had learned a long time ago that the people worth impressing didn't need theater. "The personnel record of the individual operating under the name Nora Vance," she said, without sitting, "contains a classified designation that was improperly applied under DoD Directive 5200.48, Subpart C, which governs the reclassification of active duty personnel records following special operations involvement. Specifically, the cover MOS assigned to this individual's discharge file was generated by an administrative process that did not have jurisdictional authority over a record of this classification tier." She looked up from the page. In plain language, the people who buried her file didn't have the clearance to bury it. The classification was applied incorrectly by an office that was acting outside its operational scope, and the motion to correct it that was filed approximately 26 months ago was denied by that same office, which also lacked jurisdiction to issue a denial. The room was quiet. "Which means," Terrell said slowly, "that the denial Is not legally operative, Frost said. Yes. Terrell looked at the table. He had the expression of a man seeing the shape of something he hadn't seen before and not finding the shape comfortable. What does this mean practically? Prentice asked. It means I'm filing an emergency reclassification petition this morning on behalf of the individual in question, whether or not she formally requests it, because the record error is administrative rather than disputed. It's not a matter of her appealing a decision, it's a matter of correcting a clerical and jurisdictional error that should have been caught 2 years ago. She paused. It also means that the security review initiated by this installation against this individual, she glanced at the memo in front of Terrell, is currently reviewing someone whose actual service record, if properly classified, would grant her access to facilities significantly more restricted than your TMN control room. Terrell's face did something complicated. And the suspension of her clinical rotation access, Winslow said quietly from his end of the table. Frost looked at him. Needs to be reversed. Today. She closed the document case. I need to speak with her privately before I file. Where is she? Fitch answered. Facility support rotation. She'd be in the East Corridor around this time. Frost picked up her case. Show me. What? Nora was restocking the supply room at the end of the East Corridor when she heard the footsteps. 2 sets, one heavier than the other, coming around the corner at a pace that was purposeful without being urgent. She finished placing the box of gauze pads on the second shelf before she turned around. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not in uniform, but carried herself like someone who had worn one for a long time and retained the posture as a permanent condition. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head and a document case under her arm, and she looked at Nora with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had been looking for her specifically. Nora Vance, she said. Yes. My name is Commander Adele Frost. I'm a JAG officer currently working under DoD Advisory Authority. She glanced at the supply room, at the shelves of gauze and saline and boxed gloves. Can we talk somewhere that isn't a closet? They used the small conference room on the second floor, the one that smelled like old coffee and was almost never occupied before 10. Frost's paralegal, Whitmore, took a position outside the door without being asked. Frost sat across from Nora and opened her case and laid 3 documents on the table, and Nora looked at them and recognized what they were before Frost explained anything. The first was a copy of the original classification order, the one that had generated her cover MOS. The second was the motion she'd filed herself 26 months ago through a Veterans Administration advocate who'd spent 3 months on it before hitting a wall. The third was a document she hadn't seen before, a jurisdictional analysis of the office that had processed both the original classification and the denial. She read the third document carefully. Frost let her read without interrupting. When Nora looked up, she said, "They didn't have authority." "No," Frost said. "The office that classified your record and then denied your appeal operated under a delegated authority that specifically excluded personnel files at or above the tier your record occupies. They weren't empowered to touch it in either direction." She leaned forward slightly. "Which means your record has been legally in a state of unresolved classification for 9 years, and the denial 2 years ago was issued by an entity that had no standing to issue it." Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the 3 documents on the table in front of her, laid out in a row. 9 years. She'd spent 9 years being a person whose paperwork said she was someone smaller than she was. She'd spent 26 months fighting a system that she now understood had been fighting her back with tools it wasn't supposed to have. "What happens when you file the petition?" she asked. "The record reverts to its correct classification tier. Your actual service history becomes the operative file. The cover MOS is annotated as erroneous." Frost paused. "And the Kesra Valley Incident Report, which was sealed under the same improper classification order, becomes reviewable by the relevant oversight board." The Kesra Valley Incident Report. Nora had not seen that document in 9 years. She knew what it said, she'd been there, she'd made every decision it described, but she hadn't been permitted to read the official version, hadn't known how it characterized the choices she'd made in those 47 minutes with a radio in her hand, and a strike package overhead, and no superior officer left standing to tell her what to do. "What does the report say?" she asked. Her voice was level, but she asked the question the way you ask something you've needed to ask for a long time and have been afraid of the answer. Frost looked at her. The report documents the actions of a forward communications controller who, operating without command authorization, due to the incapacitation of all superior officers in the field, independently guided close air support into a strike configuration that successfully extracted 31 personnel from an overrun position. She paused. It characterizes those decisions as tactically correct, procedurally sound, and executed under conditions of extreme duress. The outcome assessment is unambiguous. Nora held very still. There was a second section, she said. There was always supposed to be a second section. There is a second section, Frost said. It was sealed separately under a different order, a legitimate one, this time, for operational security. But the recommendations in that section have been reviewed by the current oversight board as part of my petition preparation. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not at liberty to quote it directly, but I can tell you that the word commendation appears more than once. The room was very quiet. Nora looked at the table. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in a second-floor conference room in front of a JAG officer she'd met 11 minutes ago. But something was happening in her chest that required a moment of internal management that she undertook without expression. She breathed in. She breathed out. She looked up. How long does the petition take? She asked. Preliminary ruling in 72 hours. Full reclassification can take 60 days for the formal record to update, but the preliminary ruling is operative. It changes your legal status immediately. And the security review the base opened against me becomes moot the moment the preliminary ruling is issued. Frost's expression was professionally neutral, but there was something in it, a slight tightening around the eyes, that suggested she had opinions about the security review that she was choosing not to express in formal terms. I've already spoken with General Prentice. The suspension of your clinical access is being reversed this morning. Nora nodded once. She reached out and touched the corner of the jurisdictional analysis document, not picking it up, just placing a finger on it, a small gesture. Contact with something that represented 9 years of carrying a weight she shouldn't have been made to carry. Okay, she said. Okay? Frost looked at her with something that might have been surprise, or might have been recognition. File it, Nora said. Whatever you need from me, I'll provide, but file it. Frost nodded. I'll need a signed authorization and a statement of identity confirming you are the individual named in the original classification order. She slid a single-page form across the table. If you're comfortable doing that now. Nora picked up the pen Frost offered and signed without reading the form, because she'd already read everything she needed to read. Frost watched her sign with the expression of someone who understood what the gesture cost and respected that it looked like it cost nothing. Nora was back at her supply rotation by 11. She didn't tell anyone about the meeting. She didn't have to. The base's information network had been moving faster than she could anyway. And by the time she was loading a cart with IV bags on the 3rd floor, she could feel the shift in the building, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. People were looking at her differently. Not all of them, and not obviously, but the quality of the glances had changed. Less dismissal. More uncertainty. The particular uncertainty of people who have been certain about something and are becoming less certain without yet knowing why. Priya Sarkar found her in the corridor at 11:40 and fell into step beside her without asking. She walked in silence for a moment and then said, "They reinstated your clinical access." "Yes." "That was fast." "Yes." Priya was quiet for another few steps. The JAG officer who came in this morning, Whitmore told one of the residents she was from the DoD advisory staff, not the base's JAG. She glanced at Nora sideways. That's a different level. It is. Is it about the TMN thing, or is it something else? Nora stopped the cart at the end of the corridor and began unloading IV bags into the wall cabinet, the same precise sequence she always used. It's about a record that was handled incorrectly, she said. It's being corrected. Priya leaned against the wall and watched her work. What kind of record? Nora didn't answer right away. She placed the last bag, closed the cabinet, and turned to look at Priya with the steady, measuring look she sometimes turned on people when she was deciding something. The kind that tells you who someone actually is, she said, instead of who it was convenient for them to be. Priya held her gaze. She was 28 years old and 7 months into her career, and she had grown up in a family where women were consistently told that the thing they had just done was accomplished by someone else or by luck. and she had spent her whole professional life fighting that specific sentence. She didn't know the details of what was happening with Nora Vance, but she understood the sentence. "Okay," she said quietly. Nora nodded and pushed the cart forward. At 1300, the mass casualty alert activated. It came through the system with the specific three-tone sequence that meant actual event, not drill. A sound that everyone on the medical staff had been trained to recognize and that produced a qualitatively different response in the body than the drill tone. A response that was partly training and partly something older and more animal. In Ward 3, 2 nurses froze for half a second before the training kicked in and they started moving. At the nursing station, phones lit up simultaneously. In the cafeteria, trays were abandoned mid-meal. The event was a vehicle accident on Route 9, 4 miles east of the base. A transport convoy running a logistics exercise had hit a structural failure on an elevated curve, and 2 vehicles had gone off the road. Preliminary field reports coming through the TMN, which was, this time, functioning perfectly, indicated 6 casualties, 3 of them critical. Crane Harbor's trauma bay was not large. It handled base medical events and overflow from the civilian hospital in Port Sterling on a rotating protocol, but a multi-casualty event with criticals pushed it to capacity immediately. Fitch was paged from his office at 1304. By 1310, the trauma team was assembled in the bay with the specific organized chaos of people who practice for this regularly and are nevertheless always running slightly behind the pace they'd prefer. Nora heard the alert tone from the supply room on the 2nd floor. She stood still for 3 seconds, the same 3-second pause she'd used at the supply cabinet the day the TMN went down. And then she left the cart and walked to the elevator. She arrived at the trauma bay entrance at 1314. There was a controlled frenzy inside. 2 trauma surgeons, 4 nurses, a respiratory tech, and a rotating cast of support personnel moving around 3 occupied bays with the kind of focused noise that sounds like chaos from the outside and has a specific internal logic when you know how to read it. 2 more gurneys were incoming. Doris Kaplan was at the nursing station just outside the bay entrance, coordinating the intake and looking like someone running 4 processes simultaneously and dropping none of them. She saw Nora and started to say something about clinical rotation protocol. The reinstatement had come through, but the paperwork was still processing. And then she stopped because of the way Nora was looking at the trauma bay. It was not the look of a nursing support employee assessing whether she was authorized to be somewhere. It was the look of someone reading a situation the way a pilot reads an instrument panel, rapidly, completely, without hesitation. "What do you need?" Nora said. Doris looked at her for a moment. The paperwork was still processing. The 2 incoming gurneys were 90 seconds out. One of her nurses had just been pulled to a secondary bay for a deteriorating post-surgical patient, and the trauma team inside was about to be short a set of hands on the 3rd critical, a chest injury that the field report had flagged as probable tension pneumothorax. "Bay 3, Doris said. "They're going to need a second person, and Ewan just got pulled." Nora was already moving. Bay 3 held a 22-year-old Marine named Corporal Desta Finley, who had gone through the windshield when the vehicle rolled and had 2 broken ribs, a suspected pneumothorax, and a blood pressure that was trending in the wrong direction. The attending physician, a trauma surgeon named Dr. Reyes, was working the chest while a nurse named Thomas managed the IV line and kept reading vitals aloud in the flat, continuous cadence of someone trained to maintain verbal output regardless of internal state. 90 over 60 and dropping, Tomas said. Sats at 89. "Get me a 14-gauge, Reyes said without looking up. The supply tray beside her had a 14-gauge needle decompression kit. She reached for it and her hand found empty space. The kit had been pulled to Bay 1 during the initial setup scramble and not replaced. Reyes turned to reach for the backup drawer and found Nora already beside her, placing a sealed kit on the tray. Reyes looked at her. "Cross-trained support staff," Nora said. "Tell me what you need." A fraction of a second. The kind of assessment that happens below conscious thought, reading posture and speed and the quality of someone's hands. "Hold pressure on the left lateral while I decompress," Reyes said. "Tomas, get a second line in the right AC." Nora placed both hands where Reyes indicated, firm and steady, and Reyes decompressed the tension pneumothorax with the technique that was technically correct and slightly imperfect. She was tired, she was running 3 cases, her hands had the fine tremor of adrenaline past the 4-hour mark, and there was a rush of air that confirmed the diagnosis, and Corporal Finley's oxygen saturation began a slow climb back from 89. "Sat's climbing," Tomas said. 92, 94. Reyes exhaled through her nose. She kept working. Nora kept the pressure where she'd placed it and watched Finley's face and said to Tomas, "His left pupil is slightly larger than the right. Has anyone done a neuro check?" Tomas looked up, checked, looked at Reyes. "Could be pre-existing," Reyes said, not stopping what she was doing. "Could be a head component we didn't catch in field triage. Get me a portable head CT order and page neuro." She glanced at Nora. "Good catch." The next 40 minutes were not clean. They were loud and imprecise and involved 2 equipment failures, one disagreement between Reyes and a second surgeon about the sequencing of interventions, and a supply shortage that Nora resolved by going to the 3rd-floor cabinet she'd stocked that morning and running back because the elevators were occupied. She did not perform any procedure she wasn't authorized to perform. She moved supplies, held pressure, read vitals aloud when Tomas was occupied, and called out the pupil finding that sent Finley to neuroimaging, where they discovered a small subdural hematoma that would have become a large problem within the next 2 hours. At 14:30, Corporal Finley was stable and on his way to imaging. Reyes stripped off her gloves and looked at the bay, at the organized mess of it, the used materials and the empty packaging and the general evidence of 40 minutes of hard, imperfect work. And then she looked at Nora. "Nursing support," she said. "Yes." "You called the pupil." "I noticed it." Reyes looked at her steadily. She was 43 and had been a trauma surgeon for 12 years, and she had worked with a lot of nurses, and she had a good instinct for the difference between someone who was competent and someone who was operating below their actual level. "Where did you train?" she asked. "I've had experience in trauma environments," Nora said carefully. "That's not an answer." "I know." Reyes held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment the paging system overhead activated again. Not the mass casualty tone, but the standard overhead page, asking for Commander Frost to report to the administrative conference room. A routine page, the kind that happened dozens of times a day. Except that both Nora and Reyes heard the name, and Reyes had heard enough in the past 6 hours to understand that the name was not unrelated to the woman standing in front of her. "You should probably go," Reyes said quietly. "My rotation. I'll cover it with Fitch." She paused. "Go." Nora walked to the administrative conference room at 1447 with her hands still faintly smelling of antiseptic and her scrubs carrying the particular dishevelment of someone who has spent 40 minutes in a trauma bay. She knocked and was told to enter. Frost was there. Winslow was there. Prentice was there. And there was one person she hadn't seen before. A man in his early 60s in a civilian suit who had the bearing of someone who outranked everyone in the room, including the general, by some metric that wasn't reflected in his clothing. He had thinning gray hair and a stillness that she recognized as the stillness of people who have made many consequential decisions and learned not to perform the weight of them. He looked at her when she entered, not at her badge or her scrubs or her cart, at her face. "Chief Warrant Officer Vance," he said. Nobody in the room corrected the rank. Nobody moved. Nora stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides. The title landed on her like a sound she'd heard a long time ago, in a frequency she'd stopped expecting to hear again. "I'm not currently—" she started. "No," he said. "Not currently. But the preliminary ruling on your reclassification petition was issued 11 minutes ago." He held up a document. "The ruling is operative, which means as of 11 minutes ago, your record reflects your actual service history." He set the document on the table and slid it toward her. "And your actual service history is what I've been looking for." She crossed the room. She picked up the document. She read it. The preliminary ruling was 3 pages. The first page was legal language she parsed rapidly. The jurisdictional correction, the operative date, the status of the cover MOS. The second page was the annotated service summary. 9 years of classified work laid out in the bureaucratic shorthand that compressed extraordinary things into flat, effectless sentences. The third page was the section she hadn't seen before, the recommendations section of the Keysra Valley report, the sealed half, now marked as reviewed and operative. She read it once. She read it again. "In 47 minutes on a hillside in the Keysra Valley," the report said, operating without command authority due to the complete incapacitation of all superior officers, communications controller. IRONVEIL executed a close air support coordination sequence under hostile fire conditions that directly resulted in the successful extraction of 31 personnel and the prevention of catastrophic mission failure. The decisions made during this period were characterized by tactical precision, medical awareness, and command judgment that exceeded the expected parameters of the controller role. The review board's determination is unambiguous. The actions taken were not only correct, they were the only viable actions available. The recommendation of this board for formal commendation has been suppressed in error and is hereby restored to the operative record. She read that last sentence 3 times. She put the document down on the table because her hands were not entirely steady and she didn't want them to be visible. "Who are you?" she asked the man in the suit. "My name is Calloway. I'm the Deputy Inspector General for Special Operations Personnel, DOD. He looked at her evenly. "I've been aware of your case for approximately 14 months. The reclassification petition that Commander Frost filed this morning gave us the jurisdictional opening to move on it." 14 months, she said. "There were constraints I'm not in a position to fully explain. But I want you to understand that the outcome of the original classification, the cover MOS, the suppression of the commendation, the denial of your appeal, was not the result of intentional action by this department. It was a sequence of administrative errors compounded by an office that overstepped its authority and then compounded the overstep by denying the correction." He paused. "That doesn't make it acceptable, but it's the accurate account." She looked at him. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "we begin the formal process of correcting the record fully. That takes 60 days for the complete update. But immediately, effective this morning, your record reflects your actual service history." He looked at her steadily. "And I'm here because I need to discuss what comes next." "What comes next?" she repeated. "Yes." He sat down at the table and opened a folder. "There is a matter I need to brief you on that became relevant approximately 6 weeks ago. A matter that intersects directly with the skills your record documents." He looked up at her. "And I need you to hear it before I can explain why the person who made the errors in your record is going to be sitting across from a review board in 72 hours. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tell me," she said. He opened the folder and the first page that faced her across the table was a photograph. A facility she recognized, though she hadn't seen it in 9 years, a compound in a part of the world that didn't have a name on most maps. And below it, a set of communication intercepts dated 6 weeks ago. And below those, a name that she had heard once before in a classified debrief in a room she'd never expected to be relevant to her life again. Her hands, folded on the table, went very still. "That name," she said quietly. "That name was in the Kisra Valley report." "Yes," Calloway said. "It was." He looked at her. "And 3 weeks ago, that individual made contact with a military communications network. A network whose vulnerability profile," he paused, "was consistent with the kind of knowledge that would allow someone to exploit a TMN maintenance bypass from a civilian workstation." The air in the room changed. Nora looked at the photograph. She looked at the intercepts. She looked at the name. "You think the TMN failure wasn't a system error," she said. Calloway didn't answer immediately. He looked at the folder, then at her, and the quality of his silence was the kind that confirmed what it didn't say. "The architecture review your technical staff conducted after you restored the system found something," he said. "Not in the bypass pathway, in the authentication queue. A piece of code that wasn't there before the failure. Something that was inserted during the window when the system was down." He paused. "We think the failure was induced. We think the 40-minute window was intentional. And we think the thing they were trying to do during that window required the TMN to be offline long enough for an extraction to complete." She sat with that for a moment. 40 minutes. The window she'd cut to 4. "What was being extracted?" she asked. "Personnel file data," he said. "Specifically, records of classified contractors currently operating in 3 locations internationally." He looked at her. "The extraction didn't complete because you brought the system back online 11 minutes before it should have been possible for anyone to restore it." He closed the folder. "Which is why I'm sitting here, and why I need to know whether you're willing to hear what I'm about to ask you." The room was completely silent. Nora looked at the man named Calloway, and then at Winslow, and then at the folder on the table in front of her, and then she looked at the wall, and she thought about a supply closet on the second floor, and a cleaning cart, and 7 months of even strokes across tables while someone called her a name she hadn't been called since she was 23 years old. She thought about the 47 minutes on a hillside in the Kisra Valley, about the radio in her hand and the strike package overhead, and the 31 people she'd brought home because there was nobody else left to do it, and she'd decided that was sufficient authorization. She looked back at Calloway. "Ask," she said, and in the corridor outside the conference room, moving toward the exit on his way from Major Terrell's office, where he'd just been told that his memo had been reviewed and flagged for a conduct inquiry, Harlan Meck walked past the closed door without knowing what was happening on the other side of it, without knowing that the woman he'd spent 6 weeks calling a mop jockey had just been briefed on a national security matter, and that her name, her real name, her operative name, had been spoken in that room by a Deputy Inspector General of the United States Department of Defense, and that the base he'd been casually patrolling for the last 2 months had been running a classified operation in its communications infrastructure that nobody below a certain clearance level had been authorized to know about, and that the only reason the operation hadn't succeeded was because a woman in scrubs had walked into a control room with a cleaning cart lanyard around her neck and fixed something that should have taken 40 minutes in under 4. He kept walking. He pushed through the exterior door. He stood in the parking lot in the afternoon light and pulled out his phone and stared at the notification from Major Terrell's office about the conduct inquiry and felt the ground shifting under him in a way that was not metaphorical. He didn't know yet what was coming, but the woman on the other side of that door did. Calloway spent 40 minutes briefing her. He did it without theater, no dramatic pauses, no leading questions, just information delivered in the flat, precise language of someone who had learned that clarity was more useful than presentation. Nora listened the same way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, filing each piece as it arrived and building the picture as she went. The picture was not good. The individual whose name appeared in the Kisra Valley report, a man named Aldrich Soren, who had operated as a contracted intelligence intermediary in the same region during the same period, had resurfaced 6 weeks ago through a communication intercept picked up by a signals intelligence station in the Pacific. The intercept suggested he'd established contact with a domestic network that had access to military infrastructure, specifically the kind of access that required either a compromised insider or a sophisticated exploitation of a known system vulnerability. The TMN failure at Crane Harbor, which Calloway's team had initially flagged as suspicious within 48 hours of Nora restoring it, now fit a pattern that had been emerging across 3 separate installations in the past 4 months. Crane Harbor wasn't the primary target, it was the test. A proof of concept, Nora said. Yes, they needed to demonstrate that the TMN vulnerability could be induced remotely and that the extraction window was sufficient. Crane Harbor's network architecture is older and more exposed than the primary targets. If it worked here, they'd know it would work elsewhere. And they would have confirmed it worked if the extraction had completed. Correct. She looked at the intercept documents. The code they inserted in the authentication queue during the window. You said it didn't complete, but was it fully removed? Calloway paused. The pause was a fraction of a second too long. The architecture review found and isolated it. Wallace's team removed what they identified. What they identified, she said. Another pause. There may be a residual component, Calloway said. Our technical team is working under the assumption that the insertion was layered. A visible piece designed to be found, and a secondary component designed to persist. We haven't located the secondary component yet. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, running the architecture of what she knew about layered insertions. She dealt with a variant of the technique in a different context, 9 years ago, in a communications environment not entirely unlike the TMN's legacy structure. The visible piece was always designed to be found quickly enough to create confidence. The secondary piece was always simpler, smaller, and placed somewhere that a stressed technical team running a removal operation under time pressure would be unlikely to look carefully. Have Wallace check the router's time synchronization module, she said. Not the authentication queue, the sync module. It's a background process. It runs on a separate logging cycle, and it's the kind of place that a layered insertion lands when the primary target is the queue. She looked at Calloway. It's where I would put it. Calloway looked at her for a moment, then looked at Winslow, then took out his phone and typed a message without excusing himself. "That's why you're here," Winslow said. "Not a question." "That's part of why I'm here," Calloway said. "The other part is that the individual responsible for the insertion, the domestic contact, not Soren, has been identified. The identification was made yesterday afternoon. The individual is currently on this base." The room went very still. Nora looked at him. She was running names, faces, the behavioral map she'd been building unconsciously for 7 months. The architecture of who moved where, who had access to what, who had reasons she didn't fully understand yet. "Who?" she said. Calloway looked at the folder. He turned a page. He slid a photograph across the table. She looked at it. The photograph was a security badge scan, the kind generated automatically at entry points, a routine capture that nobody thought much about. The face in the photograph was familiar, not because she knew the person well, because she'd seen him twice in the past 4 days, in places that now, retroactively, made a different kind of sense. The corpsman. The one from the other unit who kept making the wrong seating choice in the cafeteria. The one who'd looked at the table when Mech was performing. The one who'd been near the control room the day of the TMN failure, positioned in the hallway outside, close enough to the door to have been listening. His name, according to the photograph's data tag, was Specialist Ren Kassler, attached to the visiting unit from Fort Calder on a joint readiness rotation. She thought about the quality of his silence, the way he'd studied the table. She'd read it as discomfort, a decent person embarrassed by proximity to cruelty. She'd been right that he was uncomfortable, but wrong about the source. "He was in the hallway outside the control room," she said. "Yes." His badge scan places him there for 11 minutes during the failure window. He entered the corridor 30 seconds after you went in. Calloway's voice was even. "We believe his function was to monitor the restoration timeline. If the system came back online before the extraction completed, he was positioned to report it. And when it came back in 4 minutes instead of 40, he reported that too, to Soren's network, which is how we confirmed the connection. The report triggered a communication that our signals team intercepted." He paused. "The irony is that your speed in restoring the system is what gave us the evidence we needed to identify him. If it had taken 30 minutes, the extraction might have partially completed, and the communication would have been routine enough to miss." She sat with that for a moment. The particular bitter geometry of it, that the thing she'd done reflexively, without strategy, had accidentally served a strategic purpose she hadn't known existed. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "We're taking Kassler into custody this afternoon. That process is managed, and it doesn't require your involvement." He folded his hands on the table. "What I need from you is different. The residual component in the sync module, if it's there, our technical team can locate it now that you've identified the target, but removing it cleanly requires someone who understands the legacy architecture at a level our current specialists don't have. Wallace's team can execute, but they need someone who can tell them exactly what they're looking at." He looked at her steadily. "I need you in that control room. I'm not cleared for an active counterintelligence operation." "You are as of 11 minutes ago," he said. "Your reclassification is operative. Your clearance level is restored to its pre-discharge status." He paused. "Which, according to your record, is sufficient for this." She looked at him for a long moment. "When?" she said. "Now," he said. "We're taking Kassler at 1400. I want the sync module clean before he's in custody, because the moment his network detects that he's been picked up, they may attempt to activate whatever the secondary component does remotely." She stood up. The TMN control room was different the second time she walked into it. The first time she'd come through the door in scrubs with a cleaning lanyard around her neck, and 4 people had looked at her like she was in the wrong place. This time, she came through the door with Calloway behind her, and Wallace was already standing at the primary terminal, and he looked at her not with skepticism, but with the particular expression of a man who has been told something that recontextualized a prior experience and is still processing the recontextualization. "Time synchronization module," she said, moving to the secondary terminal. "Pull up the process log for the past 72 hours. Wallace pulled it up. She leaned in and read the log in the same way she read most things, quickly, looking for the thing that was slightly wrong rather than confirming what was right. The synchronization log was a column of routine entries, Timestamps at regular intervals, nothing that looked out of place unless you knew what not out of place was supposed to look like versus what not out of place was designed to look like. There. 73 minutes into the failure window. A sync entry that hit 3 seconds early. 3 seconds wasn't much. 3 seconds was well within normal variance, except that this particular architecture's synchronization cycle was not a process that varied. It was a fixed interval function, and it had run at an identical timestamp for 11 years without deviation, because the system's internal clock was hardwired to a reference signal that didn't drift. 3 seconds early meant something had interrupted the cycle. There, she said. She pointed to the entry. The cycle ran early. Something pushed it. Wallace leaned in. He looked at it. He looked at her. That's within variance. Not in this system. Pull the reference signal log from the same window. He pulled it. He looked at it. His face changed. The reference signal didn't drift, he said. No. Which means the sync module ran early because something external triggered it. That's where the secondary component lives, in the trigger mechanism. It's using the sync cycle as cover for a low bandwidth communication channel. Tiny packets, timed to piggyback on the synchronization pulse. She straightened. It's been sending since the failure. Not much, probably just status pings, but it's active. The room was very quiet. Can we remove it without triggering an alert to the network? Wallace asked. If we do it during a normal sync cycle and match the timing exactly, yes. The removal needs to look like a routine cycle to anything monitoring from outside. She looked at the log. The next scheduled cycle was in 4 minutes. We have one shot at this. If we miss the timing window, it flags. Wallace looked at his 2 junior technicians, who both looked at Nora. Walk us through it, Wallace said. She did. Not slowly, not with patience she didn't have. She talked through it at the speed of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had 4 minutes to transfer that knowledge to people who were competent but needed the specific sequence. She was direct and used no words that weren't necessary, and corrected one of the junior technicians twice without softening the correction because softening it would have cost seconds they didn't have. At 3 minutes and 47 seconds, she said, "Now." Wallace executed the sequence. The sync cycle ran. The secondary component, 14 lines of embedded code, elegant in the way that malicious things sometimes are, was excised from the module cleanly, its removal time to the pulse, indistinguishable from a routine housekeeping process to anything looking from outside. The status display didn't change. The system kept running. Calloway, standing near the door, exhaled once through his nose. "Clean?" he said. Wallace ran the verification. "Clean," he said. Calloway looked at his watch, looked at Nora. "Kassler goes into custody in 8 minutes," he said. "Whatever his network was monitoring, it just stopped receiving. They'll know something happened eventually, but not in time to matter." She nodded. She stepped back from the terminal and Wallace took over, running the full verification protocol with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had learned from experience to check everything twice. She watched him work and thought about 7 months of cleaning tables and restocking supply cabinets and absorbing a loud sergeant's contempt in a cafeteria. And she thought about the specific strange luck of being exactly the right person in exactly the wrong job at exactly the right moment. Ren Kassler was taken into custody at 14:03 in the east parking lot by 2 plainclothes agents from Calloway's department who looked, until the moment they produced their credentials, like contractors doing nothing in particular. He said nothing when they identified themselves. He looked, according to the agent who filed the initial report, like someone who had been expecting it and was nevertheless not ready for it. The specific expression of a person whose contingency plan has arrived and turned out to be insufficient. Nora was not present for the arrest. She was in the supply room on the 2nd floor, restocking IV bags, because Calloway had told her the arrest didn't require her and she'd agreed and gone back to her rotation. This was not because she was indifferent to the outcome. It was because she understood the difference between involvement that served a purpose and presence that served an impulse, and she'd learned, in years of operating in environments where that distinction kept people alive, to tell the difference. She found out it was done when Calloway knocked on the supply room door at 14:20 and said simply, "It's done." "Right," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the particular look of someone recalibrating an assessment in real time. "You're restocking IV bags." The cabinet was low. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. I need you in the conference room at 1600. General Prentice wants to make a formal statement to the base command staff, and Commander Frost needs your presence for the record. She placed the last bag and closed the cabinet. I'll be there. The formal statement happened in the main briefing room, not the small conference room, because Prentice had decided that the number of people who needed to hear it exceeded what the small room could hold. The base command staff sat in the first two rows. Behind them, a wider group, senior medical staff, department heads, and a cross-section of the installation's officers that Nora understood, when she walked in, had been assembled deliberately. Not just for logistics, for witness. She sat in the front row beside Commander Frost. Colonel Winslow sat 2 seats down. Calloway stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his face neutral. Harlan Mech was seated in the third row, between 2 officers from his battalion, with the posture of someone who had been told to be here and understood, by now, that the reason was not going to be comfortable. He had received the notice of the conduct inquiry that morning. He'd also heard, through the base's information network, that the nursing support employee he'd been publicly mocking for 6 weeks had been in the TMN control room with the DoD Deputy Inspector General. He'd heard the word classified and the word reclassification and the phrase operative clearance, and he'd spent the afternoon reassembling his understanding of the past 6 weeks into a shape he didn't like. He didn't look at Nora when she walked in. She didn't look at him. Prentice stood at the front of the room with the bearing of a man who was doing something he found uncomfortable and had decided to do it correctly anyway. He was not a man who enjoyed being wrong. He was, Nora had decided, a man who understood that being wrong visibly and addressing it directly was less costly than the alternative. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not read from notes. He described the TMN incident and its actual cause, the induced failure, the attempted data extraction, the code found in the authentication queue. He described the arrest of Specialist Kassler and the confirmed connection to an external intelligence network. He described the secondary component in the synchronization module and its removal. He gave the full account without editorializing, without softening the implications, without managing the room's discomfort. And then he described Nora Vance. He used her name and her rank, the rank that had been restored that morning, Chief Warrant Officer, which several people in the room visibly reacted to when they heard it paired with the woman they'd seen pushing a cleaning cart. He described the TMN restoration. He described the mass casualty response and the pupil finding that had identified Corporal Finley's subdural hematoma. He described the sync module analysis and the removal operation. He read, without abridgment, the operational summary from the Kisra Valley report, the one that had been sealed for 9 years, now restored to its correct classification tier and readable, finally, by people in the same room as the person it described. The room was completely silent by the time he finished the Kisra Valley summary. In the third row, Harlan Mech sat with his hands in his lap and his jaw set in the rigid way of someone receiving information their body hadn't processed yet. The woman he'd called Rookie. The woman he'd used as entertainment for 2 months in front of hundreds of Marines. The woman whose table he'd smeared with his fingers while his table mates laughed. 31 people. A hillside. A radio in her hand and every superior officer down. He looked at his hands. Prentice was not finished. I want to address the conduct inquiry that was initiated following a memo filed by Sergeant First Class Mech, he said, and his voice had changed. It was still even, but there was a weight in it now that hadn't been there during the factual recitation. The memo in question was filed as a security concern regarding Chief Warrant Officer Vance's credentials. It was filed after a pattern of public behavior toward this officer that I am characterizing, formally, and for the record, as conduct unbecoming. He looked at Mech directly. The inquiry will proceed. The findings will reflect the full record of Sergeant Mech's conduct at this installation, including the public incidents documented by multiple witnesses over the past 6 weeks. Mech's face was completely still. The officer on his left shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. That inquiry is separate from this briefing, Prentice continued, but it is connected, and I want this command staff to understand the connection clearly. When we dismiss someone's value based on what we assume about them from what we can see, we create vulnerabilities. We make decisions based on incomplete data, and we call it judgment. He paused. We're not going to do that here. Not anymore. He looked at Nora then, for the first time since the briefing started, and his expression was not warm, Prentice was not a warm man, and he was not going to perform warmth, but it carried something genuine, acknowledgement, the particular acknowledgement of someone who understands the size of what they got wrong. "Thank you, Chief Warrant Officer," he said, "for fixing what needed to be fixed, all of it." The room was still for a moment, and then, from somewhere in the middle rows, someone began to applaud, not enthusiastically, a single person, measured and deliberate, which made it louder than it would have been if a crowd had started simultaneously. The sound expanded, one person at a time, filling the room the way things fill rooms when they're real rather than performed. Nora sat with her hands in her lap and looked at a fixed point on the far wall and let it happen without expression, because she was not going to cry in a briefing room in front of the base command staff, and she was also not going to perform composure, so she simply held the point on the wall and breathed and let the sound continue until it stopped. Afterward, in the corridor outside the briefing room, Priya Sarkar found her. She'd been in the back of the room. Fitch had included the senior nursing staff in the assembled group, and she'd sat through the entire briefing with the focused attention of someone committing it to memory. Now she stood in the corridor looking at Nora with the expression of someone who wants to say something and is not sure what it is. "The pupil," she finally said. "What?" "In the trauma bay. You called it. You looked at Finley for maybe 3 seconds, and you called it." She paused. "I've been doing this for 7 months, and I don't know if I would have caught that." "You would have eventually," Nora said, "but not in time." Priya shook her head. How do you learn to see like that?" Nora thought about it, actually thought about it, rather than deflecting. "You stop looking for what you expect to see," she said. "You look for what's actually there. Most of the time they're the same. When they're not, that's the thing." Priya was quiet for a moment. "They're going to offer you something, aren't they? Something official, after all this." "Maybe." "Are you going to take it?" Nora looked at the corridor, the institutional floor, the fluorescent lights, the wall-mounted emergency equipment she'd restocked 3 days ago. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "For what it's worth," Priya said, and she stopped and started again. "I used to think that being seen was the whole point. Like if I worked hard enough, eventually the right people would notice, and it would matter." She looked at Nora. "I'm starting to think that's not exactly right." "What do you think now?" "I think the work is the point. The being seen," she paused. "That's just what happens eventually, if you don't stop doing the work." Nora looked at her for a moment. "You're going to be good at this," she said, and she meant it, and Priya knew she meant it. Mech found her at 17:30. She was in the East Corridor, finishing the last segment of her facility rotation, because her shift wasn't over, and there was no version of this day in which she left work unfinished. She heard his footsteps coming, heavier than usual, slower, and she kept moving the cloth in even strokes across the table surface, the same rhythm she'd been using for 7 months. He stopped 6 feet away. She didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was working on something, and that the something wasn't coming easily. "Vance," he said. Then, correcting himself, she could hear the correction cost him something. "Chief Warrant Officer." She put down the cloth. She turned and looked at him. He looked worse than she'd expected. Not physically. He was the same large, solid man she'd watched perform cruelty in front of hundreds of people every morning for 6 weeks. But the performance was gone. What was underneath it was smaller and more complicated, and the complication showed in the set of his jaw and the way he was looking at her. Not at a point past her shoulder, not at the room, at her. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. "I don't have a speech prepared. I looked like an idiot in that room." "Yes," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't." He swallowed. "I thought you were— I assessed you wrong. I assessed you wrong from the start, and I didn't correct it because it was convenient not to. I was wrong, and I was public about it, and I made it—" He paused. "I made it hard for you. In a place where you should have been able to do your job." She looked at him for a long moment. I was not performing contrition. She could tell the difference, had spent years reading people in high-stakes environments. But he was also not entirely settled in it yet. He was a man who understood what he'd done but hadn't fully integrated the understanding, which was honest and therefore more useful than the alternative. "I know," she said. "I don't know if you'll accept an apology." I don't need to accept it for you to mean it, she said. That part's yours. He held her gaze. He nodded once, a short, tight movement, the kind of nod that contains things a person doesn't have words for yet. She picked up her cloth and turned back to the table. The conduct inquiry, he said. Whatever comes out of it, I'm not going to fight it. She kept moving the cloth. Okay. He stood there for another moment. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, and she heard his footsteps getting quieter, and she finished the table and moved to the next one and kept working until the corridor was done. Calloway found her at 18:15 as she was returning her cart to the supply closet. He was still in his civilian suit, which after a full day on a military installation looked like it had been through something. He had his phone in his hand and the expression of someone who has completed a large thing and is now in the phase of calculating what comes next. The sync module is confirmed clean, he said. Wallace ran 3 full verification cycles. Good. Kassler is in federal custody. He'll be processed at a facility in Sacramento. The legal process will take time. He paused. Soren's network has gone quiet. They know something happened. They don't know what yet. We have a window. A window for what? He looked at her steadily. There are 3 installations I mentioned, the ones that were the primary targets. Their TMN architecture is more current than Crane Harbor's, but the same vulnerability class applies. If Soren's network decides to move on them before we can issue a system-wide patch. He stopped. The patch takes 30 days to develop and validate. We have less than that. She closed the supply closet door. You want me to look at the other installations, she said. I want you to consult on the vulnerability assessment. Whether the same bypass exists in current generation architecture, and if so, where? Your understanding of the legacy system's construction informed your analysis here. I need that understanding applied to the updated version. He paused. I know you've been asked to give a lot today. That's not a no, she said. He looked at her. Is it a yes? She thought about the 3 installations, the personnel records stored on their networks, the contracted individuals operating internationally whose identities those records contained. She thought about what happened to people whose covers were blown, and about the specific irreversibility of that kind of harm. She thought about a hillside in the Kisra Valley, about the arithmetic of situations where someone has to do something, and the question is only whether that someone is the right person. She was the right person. She had been for 9 years, and she was still. Yes, she said, but I want something in return. Calloway's expression didn't change. What? The record correction, the full update, not the preliminary. I know it takes 60 days, but I want the process formally initiated by end of business today, with documentation I can hold. Done, he said. Frost is filing the initiation paperwork now. And I want my role at this installation formally reclassified, not eliminated. I want to stay here in this department, but I want the position description to reflect what I'm actually doing. He looked at her for a moment. That's not a standard request. I'm not a standard situation. He almost smiled, not quite. I'll talk to Prentice. She nodded. She picked up her bag from the hook inside the supply closet door. She looked at the closet, the shelves she'd organized, the chemical logs she'd maintained, the quiet geography of a space she'd spent 7 months treating with the same care she'd brought to every environment she'd ever been responsible for. One more thing, she said. What? She looked at him. The corpsman who's been monitoring the situation from outside, Chow, Kassler. You said he was from Fort Calder. Was anyone else from his unit involved, or was the access isolated to him? Calloway went very still. Why? Because there was a second badge scan I noticed. The day of the TMN failure. Not Kassler's. Kassler's, a different scan, different unit, 30 minutes earlier. I noted it at the time as routine. I'm not sure it was. The corridor was quiet. Calloway looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just realized that the person in front of them has been running a parallel analysis throughout the entire conversation, filing information, cross-referencing, holding a piece until the right moment. Show me, he said. She walked him to the security office and pulled up the badge scan log herself, because she knew the system and she knew exactly which timestamp she was looking for, and she found it in under 2 minutes. She pointed to the entry. Calloway looked at it for a long time. Then he took out his phone and made a call, and the first thing he said was, "We may have a second actor. I need a name on a badge number." He read the number aloud. He listened. His face did not change, but he turned and looked at Nora with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not assessment, not the careful neutrality of a man managing a briefing. Something closer to the recognition of a mistake he hadn't known he was making. "That badge number," he said when the call ended, "belongs to someone currently sitting in this building. Someone on the base's administrative staff who has been here for 11 months and whose personnel file was reviewed 2 weeks ago as part of a routine security audit." He paused. "And cleared." She looked at him. "The audit was conducted by the same office that improperly classified your record," he said. His voice was completely even, but what was underneath it was not. The office that was operating outside its jurisdictional authority. The corridor was very quiet, which means the clearance they issued, she said slowly, has the same jurisdictional problem as my classification. "Yes, which means the audit result isn't operative." "No," he said, "it isn't." They looked at each other in the dim corridor light, and outside the security office window, the base was running its end-of-day routines, vehicles moving, lights coming on in the administrative wing, the distant percussion of evening formation. And somewhere in this building, a person who had been cleared by an authority that didn't have the power to clear them was finishing out their Thursday, unaware that the woman they'd watched carry a cleaning cart for 7 months had just read a timestamp and traced a thread that was about to unravel everything they'd spent 11 months building. The name came back in 4 minutes. Calloway listened to his phone, said nothing, ended the call, and stood in the corridor for a moment with the specific stillness of someone absorbing a piece of information that changes the geometry of everything they thought they understood. "Miriam Lowe," he said, "Administrative Records Coordinator, assigned to the base personnel office 11 months ago through a DoD placement program." He looked at Nora. "The placement program was administered by the same regional office that improperly classified your record." She processed that. "So they had access going back further than Kassler." "Much further. Kassler was the technical arm. Well, he knew the network architecture because he'd been briefed on it. Lowe was the intelligence arm. She's been in the personnel office for 11 months with full access to every record on this installation." He paused. "We think she was the one who identified which records were worth extracting. Kassler executed the technical operation. Lowe told him what to look for. And the audit 2 weeks ago was conducted partly using data that ran through her office." He said it flatly, the way you say things that are both true and deeply unpleasant. She would have known the audit was happening. She would have managed what it found. Nora looked at the badge scan timestamp on the screen in front of her. 30 minutes before the TMN failure. Lowe's badge placed her in the East Corridor. Not the control room, not near it, but in the data routing hub that fed the TMN's authentication system. A place she had legitimate reasons to be, as a records coordinator. A place nobody would have questioned. "She primed it," Nora said. "Kassler induced the failure remotely, but she set up the conditions physically, 30 minutes before." "That's what the timeline suggests." She turned away from the screen. "Where is she now?" "Personnel office closes at 1700. If she's still on base..." He checked his phone. "Her vehicle is in the east lot. She hasn't left." Nora thought about the geometry of the next 30 minutes. Lowe didn't know yet that Kassler had been taken. The arrest had been quiet. Plain clothes, east parking lot, no announcement. The base's end-of-day routine was proceeding normally. If Lowe was running on the assumption that Kassler's arrest hadn't happened, she would be behaving normally, which meant she was either in the personnel office finishing her shift or already moving toward her vehicle. If she reached her vehicle and made contact with the network before Calloway's team could reach her, the secondary operation, whatever Kassler hadn't finished, could still be activated through her. "How long to get your people to the east lot?" Nora said. 6 minutes, maybe 5. "Her office is 3 minutes from the east lot on foot." She looked at him. "You need to call it now." He was already dialing. Miriam Lowe was arrested at 1841 in the East Corridor, 40 feet from the personnel office door, with her bag over her shoulder and her access card in her hand. She had been preparing to badge out for the evening. She did not run. She did not speak. She looked at the 2 agents who identified themselves, and she looked at the third person standing at the end of the corridor, Nora, who had walked down to document the timestamp, which was her technical function and nothing more. And something moved across Lowe's face that was not quite surprise. It was the expression of someone who had been running a probability calculation and had always known this was one of the outcomes. She looked at Nora for a moment. She said quietly and without inflection, "The badge scan." "Yes," Nora said. Lo nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. Then she went with the agents without another word, and the corridor was quiet again, and Nora stood in it for a moment before turning and walking back to the administrative wing. The full picture assembled itself over the next 72 hours in the way that full pictures do. Not cleanly, not in a single revelation, but in pieces that arrived at different times and required recombination. Calloway's team worked through the night and into Friday, and by Saturday morning they had enough to brief General Prentice on the complete operational scope of what Lowe and Kassler had built over 11 months. It was larger than the TMN extraction. Lowe had spent 11 months systematically mapping the base's personnel records, identifying classified contractors whose cover identities ran through Crane Harbor's administrative systems, and building an extraction architecture that Kassler had been placed specifically to execute. The TMN failure had been the first operational test. The information she'd gathered would have funded 3 more operations at higher value installations. The placement program that had put her at Crane Harbor had been legitimate on paper and corrupted in practice. A mid-level administrator in the regional DoD office had been compromised 18 months earlier, and the compromise had been invisible because the auditing process for that office had a gap, and the gap had been filled, on paper, by an audit conducted using data that ran through Lowe's own desk. The circular nature of it, the way the corruption had been made to audit itself, was what Calloway described in a briefing on Saturday afternoon as architecturally elegant and genuinely infuriating. He said it with the tone of someone who had spent a career finding and dismantling things that other people had built specifically to be hard to find and dismantle. He also said, without editorial comment, that the gap in the auditing process for the regional DoD office was the same gap that had allowed the improper classification of Nora's record 9 years earlier. Not the same people, not the same operation, but the same structural weakness in the oversight system. The same place where the architecture had a seam, and the seam had never been properly sealed. He told her this on Saturday morning, in the small garden behind the East Wing, which had become, without either of them planning it, the place where they had direct conversations. The sparrow was back on the concrete planter. The half-dead plant looked slightly more dead than it had the week before. "The same gap," she said. "Yes." She sat with that. The particular bitter geometry of it, that the thing that had buried her record and the thing that had nearly compromised 3 installations were different expressions of the same original failure. Different people, different years, different intentions, same structural whole. "Is it being fixed?" she asked. "It is now," he said. The Inspector General's office issued a priority audit order on that regional office yesterday morning. It'll be uncomfortable for a number of people. He paused. Some of whom probably deserve the discomfort more than they've been made to feel it so far. She nodded. She looked at the garden and thought about 9 years and what 9 years amounted to when the thing that shaped them turned out to have been built on a procedural error in an office that shouldn't have had jurisdiction. She thought about whether that made the 9 years feel different and found that the answer was complicated. The years had happened. She'd spent them. The cleaning tables and the supply closets and the early mornings with a badge that said one thing while she was another. Those had happened, and they'd been real, and she couldn't unchoose them even if she'd wanted to. She wasn't sure she wanted to. "The offer," she said. "You mentioned it Thursday. You said you'd talk to Prentice." "I did talk to Prentice." Calloway looked at her. "He'd like to formalize your role here, as you requested. The position description is being rewritten to reflect your actual function, which, as of this week, apparently includes tactical communications analysis, trauma support, and counterintelligence assistance, none of which appear in the original nursing support job description. What does the new title look like? That's partly up to you. The base is willing to classify you as a special technical advisor, which gives you the access tier your clearance supports, and keeps you embedded in the medical center's structure." He paused. "There's also a longer-term offer. The Inspector General's office is building a vulnerability assessment team for military medical network infrastructure. Given what you found here, the bypass, the sync module, the badge scan, you'd be the natural lead for the communication security component." She was quiet for a moment. That would mean leaving Crane Harbor, she said. It would be based here initially. The team is still in formation. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to pressure you. You've been pressured by institutional systems for 9 years. That's not what this is. She looked at the garden. The sparrow had gone. The concrete planter sat in a patch of morning light that was, she allowed herself to notice, genuinely pleasant. Let me think about it, she said. Take the time you need. He stood. The record update initiates Monday. Full reclassification, 60-day process, all documentation in your hands by end of business today. He looked down at her. Whatever you decide, you should know that what happened here this week is going into the formal record. What you did. All of it. She looked up at him. You mean the stuff this week, or? I mean Kesra Valley, he said. The commendation that was suppressed. It's being formally issued. There's a ceremony. You don't have to attend, but the record will reflect it either way. She didn't say anything. She looked at the planter again and thought about 47 minutes on a hillside and 31 people who went home, and the specific loneliness of knowing that you'd done something that mattered, and having the official record say you'd done something else entirely. Okay, she said. It was a small word for what it contained. He understood that, and he nodded once and left her in the garden. The ceremony was 10 days later. It was not large, Calloway had asked, and she'd said small, and he'd honored that. The briefing room held 40 people, the base command staff, Frost, Winslow, Fitch, Reyes, Doris Kaplan, Priya Sarkar, Wallace, and a handful of others who'd been part of the week's events in one way or another. Corporal Desta Finley was there, ambulatory now, with a bandage still visible at his hairline, sitting in the second row with the careful posture of someone whose ribs were healing but not healed. Prentice conducted the ceremony. He read the commendation language from the Kesra Valley report, the full text without abridgment, and the room absorbed it in the particular silence that settles over people when they are hearing something they understand to be genuinely important. When he pinned the decoration, his hands were steady and his face was not performing anything. This should have happened 9 years ago, he said quietly, so that only she could hear. I'm sorry it didn't. It happened now, she said. That was all she said because it was enough. Afterward, Finley found her near the door. He was 22 and still slightly pale, and he stood in front of her with the specific discomfort of someone who understands they owe a debt they can't calculate. I heard it was you, he said. In Bay 3. He touched his temple carefully. You would have been caught eventually, she said. Maybe. He looked at her, but not in time. She looked at him. This young man who'd gone through a windshield at 22 and had a small hematoma that would resolve fully and a life that was going to continue because someone had looked at his pupils. She thought about what she'd said to Priya. You stop looking for what you expect to see. You look for what's actually there. Take care of yourself, she said. Come back through the medical center in 6 weeks for the follow-up imaging. He nodded. He started to say something else and then didn't, because sometimes there isn't a word for what you mean. And the absence of the word is more honest than finding a substitute. He shook her hand instead. She let him. Well, Harlan Meck's conduct inquiry concluded the same week as the ceremony. The findings were thorough because the documentation was thorough. Multiple witnesses, a pattern of behavior that spanned 6 weeks, public incidents that had been observed by enough people that the record was essentially uncontested. He didn't contest it. He'd said he wouldn't, and he didn't. The outcome was a formal reprimand, a reduction in his leadership responsibilities pending a remediation process, and a mandatory transfer out of Crane Harbor at the end of his current rotation. He would not be promoted at the next cycle. The promotion he'd been expecting, the one he'd been positioning himself for through the performance of authority and the cultivation of audiences, was deferred indefinitely, pending the remediation's outcome. He accepted the findings in a room with the inquiry board and his battalion commander and signed the acknowledgement form without extended comment. He said to the board that he understood the findings were accurate and that he didn't have grounds to dispute them. He said it in the flat, careful voice of a man who has had 10 days to think about what he'd done and has arrived, not at peace, but at a kind of honest accounting. He was not broken by it. He was changed by it, which was different, and which was, if the change held, if he let it, actually more consequential. Nora wasn't in the room for the inquiry conclusion. She was in the TMN control room with Wallace, finishing the third and final verification cycle on the sync module clean. She heard about the outcome from Winslow that evening. She heard it and nodded and thought about the corridor conversation. I don't have a speech prepared. And thought that there was something almost human in the absence of the speech, and that absence would have to be enough to work with. She didn't think Mech was a monster. She'd never thought that. Monsters were easier. Harlan Mech was a man who'd been given too much authority and too receptive an audience and not enough accountability, and he'd grown into the space those conditions created the way things grow into the space available to them. The accountability had arrived late. It had arrived. She'd learned in 9 years of operating in environments where the difference between justice and its absence was sometimes a matter of hours, that late and never were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was worth something. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Nora accepted the position on the vulnerability assessment team. She told Calloway on a Tuesday, in the garden, over coffee. He received the news with the particular satisfaction of someone who had expected a yes and had nevertheless been prepared for a no, and he told her the team's initial meeting was scheduled for the following month, and that she'd be meeting 2 other specialists whose backgrounds were, like hers, compressed into cover designations on official paperwork that told approximately 15% of the actual story. She thought she might like them. Her role at Crane Harbor was formalized the same week: Special Technical Advisor, Clinical and Communication Security, a title that contained multitudes without explaining any of them, which was fine. She kept her supply rotation on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She kept restocking the third-floor cabinet and checking the chemical levels in the spray bottles out of habit, in the same order, every time. Some habits are just good practice. Some habits are how you stay anchored to the thing that actually matters, which is not the title or the recognition, but the work. The specific, daily, unglamorous work of keeping things functional and keeping people alive. Priya Sarkar asked her, one Thursday morning, if she wanted to supervise a clinical skills session for the junior nursing staff. Nora said yes. She ran the session on a Friday afternoon in Ward 3's training room, and she taught it the same way she did everything. Without theater, without softening, with the expectation that the people in the room were capable of handling accurate information delivered directly. She spent 20 minutes on the pupil assessment. She said, without drama, that you could save a life by looking at something for 3 seconds if you knew what to look for, and had trained yourself to look at what was actually there rather than what you expected to see. She said it was a skill, and skills were learned, and that no one in the room should assume their current level was their ceiling. She said it because it was true. She also said it because she'd spent 9 years operating below her actual ceiling while an institutional error sat in a filing cabinet in a regional office and told the world a different story. And she understood now, in a way she hadn't when she was angry about it, that ceilings were sometimes external things, and external things could be changed. The junior nursing staff listened without interrupting. Priya, sitting at the back of the room, watched Nora the way she'd been watching her since the cafeteria, with the specific attention of someone who is learning something that no training manual has managed to teach. After the session, one of the nurses, a young man named Tobias, who'd been at Crane Harbor for 4 months, and had the particular earnestness of someone who takes everything seriously and is slightly embarrassed about it, came up and asked her how long it took to get good at reading people that way. She thought about it honestly. "A long time," she said. "And then it's still not perfect. You still miss things. You're just wrong, less often." He nodded like she'd confirmed something important. "Okay," he said. "That's actually helpful." "Good," she said. That was the point. Wong. On the last Friday of the month, she went to the cafeteria at 7:15. Not because she had a cleaning rotation. She didn't. The position reclassification had removed her from the facility support schedule. She went because it was where she'd started, 7 months ago, pushing a cart into a loud room with her head down and her jaw set, and the long patience of someone who has learned that the work is the work, regardless of who's watching. She got a cup of coffee and sat at a table near the window, the same table she'd been cleaning the morning Mech had dragged his fingers across it. She sat with the coffee and looked at the room. The tables and the trays and the noise of the morning rush, the residents and the Marines and the support staff all moving through the same space with the specific preoccupied energy of people who have somewhere to be. Nobody called her rookie. Nobody called her mop. A corpsman from the 3rd floor waved. Wallace, getting coffee near the dispensers, nodded at her with the small, compressed acknowledgement of someone who has recalibrated an opinion and doesn't feel the need to make a speech about it. Doris Kaplan came through the line at 7:30 and stopped at Nora's table without sitting down. She looked at Nora for a moment with the expression of someone who has opinions she hasn't fully organized. "The clinical skills session," she said. "The junior staff have been talking about it. Good or bad?" "Good." Doris paused. "Tobias ran a full assessment on the patient in room 6 this morning that he wouldn't have done before. Caught an early-stage complication." She looked at Nora steadily. "So, good." She walked away without further ceremony, which was exactly what Nora would have expected from her. And Nora drank her coffee and watched the room and thought about the specific strange arc of the past 7 months. From the cleaning cart to the control room to the garden to the ceremony to here, a table by a window with a cup of coffee and a title that finally matched the person holding it. She wasn't at peace with all of it. The 9 years didn't disappear because the record had been corrected. The weight of them, the mornings she'd spent in supply closets, the conversations she'd absorbed in silence, the particular exhaustion of being consistently less than you were, that weight didn't evaporate. It became part of the record too, the lived record that no archive updates, and she would carry it the way you carry things that have shaped you, not lightly, but also not as a wound. There was something she had understood in the garden on that first Thursday morning when Winslow had asked her why she was here that she'd only half articulated. She'd said routine. She'd said she wanted to stay near the work. Both of those things were true, but they weren't the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had needed to know she could still do it. Not the classified version, not the mission-critical version, but the daily version. The version that asks you to show up and do the work when nobody is watching and there's no recognition coming, and the person 2 tables over thinks you're the least important person in the room. That version is harder than most people understand. It requires a different kind of courage than the kind that gets commended. Quieter, less legible, more easily mistaken for nothing. She'd done it for 7 months. She'd do it for however many months came after. The room moved around her, loud and purposeful and imperfect, and she finished her coffee and set the cup down and thought about the vulnerability assessment team meeting next month and the 3 other installations and the work that was waiting in all of them. And she thought that she was, for the first time in 9 years, exactly where her record said she was. Not because the record had been corrected, because she'd never stopped being that person, even when the record said otherwise. She'd been IRONVEIL cleaning tables. She'd been a chief warrant officer stocking IV bags. She'd been, every single morning, the full version of herself. And the world had simply needed time to catch up. That's the thing about quiet strength. It doesn't require an audience to be real. It doesn't require a title to function. It doesn't stop because someone calls it by the wrong name. It just keeps working, even when nobody's watching, especially then. The cafeteria was full and loud and nobody was looking at her, and that was completely fine, and she stood up and walked out into the morning.